Harlan ripped the classified folder straight from her hands and threw it down like garbage. "You don't belong here, sweetheart." He turned his back on her. "This room is for people who survive outside an office." The laughter hit her from every direction. Laurel didn't move. Her eyes went to the tactical map, to the red grease pencil line crossing the pressure ridge that had already killed 2 of her men 7 years ago. Same coordinates, same fatal assumption that the ice would hold. He just signed 12 death warrants and called it a briefing. She had 36 hours and 0 rank she was allowed to use. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The folder hit the table between them like a verdict. Harlan had yanked it from her grip without warning, not asked for it, not questioned why she had it, just taken it the way men like him took things they assumed belonged to them by right of rank, size, and the particular confidence that comes from never once being told no. He'd walked into the briefing room, scanned the faces, found hers, and made a decision about her in the space of a single breath. Laurel Kane let him have the folder. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her face completely still, and she let Lieutenant Commander Bryce Harlan stand there holding classified Arctic infiltrations routes like he'd just rescued them from someone dangerous. Around the table, 4 SEALs in cold weather gear watched the exchange with the particular attention men give to moments they intend to retell later. One of them, young, square-jawed, with the easy grin of someone who'd never had his confidence tested seriously, was already smiling. "This room is for people who survive outside an office," Harlan said. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man who'd spent 20 years being right in rooms where being right meant something. He set the folder down in front of himself and looked at her the way someone looks at furniture that's been placed incorrectly. "You're the safety specialist they sent from the mainland." "Laurel Kane," Laurel said. "Civilian Administrative Safety Specialist. I was assigned to observe the pre-exercise briefing. You were assigned to the wrong room. The briefing is for the under-ice exercise scheduled for Thursday. I know what the briefing is for." Harlan pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He didn't look at her again immediately. He opened the folder, flipped through 2 pages, and addressed the room as if she'd already left. "Gentlemen, let's get started. We've got a weather window that closes Thursday evening, and I want everyone in the water by 0600. Laurel didn't move. One of the SEALs, the smiling one, finally said it out loud. "Ma'am, there's a supply office on the far side of the main building. Second door on the left. They've probably got forms that need organizing." He said it pleasantly, the way you'd give directions to someone who was clearly lost. Light laughter moved through the room. Laurel looked at the tactical map spread across the table. She'd studied it for 2 hours the previous night. She knew that particular stretch of coastline better than anyone in this room, had crawled across it in a dry suit in February 7 years ago, had felt the ice shift under her team at 3 in the morning, had memorized the pressure ridge patterns the way you memorize the face of someone you nearly lost. She looked at the route Harlan had marked in red grease pencil and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air moving through the building's ventilation system. "That route crosses an unstable pressure ridge," she said. Harlan stopped reading. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. "Excuse me," Harlan said. "The infiltration route. It crosses a pressure ridge approximately 400 meters north of Checkpoint 2. Laurel kept her voice level. She wasn't performing calm, she was calm, which was different. And sometimes that difference made people angrier than anger would have. Geological survey data from last March indicates significant lateral movement in that section. The ice thickness drops from roughly 3 feet to under 18 inches across a 40-meter band. If the temperature continues dropping at its current rate, you'll see refreezing on the surface, but the structural instability underneath won't resolve for another 6 to 8 weeks. Harlan set down the folder. He looked at her fully for the first time since walking in. "How," he said slowly, "does a civilian safety specialist from the mainland know what a geological survey from last March says about pressure ridge movement on Kodiak Island?" "I read the surveys," Laurel said. "They're in the facility's safety documentation archive." "It's my job to read them." Silence. Then Harlan said, "Your job is to make sure the forms are filled out correctly and the fire extinguishers are current." He picked up the folder again. "The route has been assessed by trained SEAL operators with Arctic warfare qualifications. I appreciate your diligence with the paperwork, Ms. Kane, but we don't need a civilian reading geological surveys and second-guessing mission planning." "I'm not second-guessing. I'm flagging a documented safety risk in advance of an exercise involving 12 operators under live ice conditions. And I'm telling you the risk has been assessed." His voice hardened at the edges. "By people qualified to assess it. Has anyone physically walked the ridgeline since the March survey?" Harlan looked at her the way he might look at a screen door on a submarine. Patient. Faintly incredulous. Like he was waiting for her to understand something obvious. "Ms. Kane," he said. "I'm going to say this once because I don't have time to say it twice. This is a SEAL cold weather training detachment operating at the edge of the world under a classified exercise mandate. The men in this room have thousands of hours of combined Arctic dive experience. You have a temporary badge and a rental car." He closed the folder with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "Go organize the supply forms, that's where you belong." Someone at the table made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but wasn't quite not one, either. Laurel stood. She picked up her notebook. She'd been taking notes since she walked in. Small, neat handwriting, in a grid pattern that would have looked like routine administrative documentation to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She looked at the tactical map one more time. At the red grease pencil line running directly through the section of ice she'd identified. "Thank you for your time, Commander," she said. She walked out. She didn't go to the supply office. She went to the maintenance bay. The facility sat on the southwestern edge of Kodiak Island. A collection of prefabricated structures and reinforced hangars bolted to a stretch of frozen coastline that the Navy had been using for cold weather special operations training since the mid-1980s. In summer, it was remote. In February, it was something else entirely, a place where the wind came off the water at angles that felt deliberate, where the daylight lasted 6 hours, and the darkness was the particular quality of darkness that makes you understand why ancient people were afraid of the night. Laurel had been on base for 14 hours. In those 14 hours, she had walked every corridor of every building, read every posted safety notice, cataloged every maintenance log she could access with her civilian credentials, and identified 3 things that didn't add up. The maintenance bay was where the 4th thing was. It was a large space, cold even by the facility standard, smelling of rubber and hydraulic fluid and the faint metallic undertone of equipment that had been used hard and cleaned imperfectly. Along the far wall, 12 rebreather units were racked in a row, each tagged with a sequential exercise number, Thursday's exercise. 12 operators. Closed-circuit diving rigs designed for cold water operations where exhaled breath recycled through a chemical scrubber instead of being released as bubbles because bubbles meant noise, and noise meant detection. And this was a facility where the whole point was to do things without being detected. Laurel stood in front of the rack for a moment, then pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves she'd carried in her jacket pocket and started examining the units. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her credentials gave her access to administrative spaces, safety documentation, and common areas. The maintenance bay was a gray zone technically accessible under her safety auditor mandate, technically something that could get her removed from the facility if Harlan decided to push it. She examined the first unit carefully, then the second. On the third, she found it, the control valve assembly. It was the right shape, the right color. It had the right manufacturer's markings on the housing and the right serial number format stamped into the metal. But the finish was wrong, slightly too smooth where it should have been matte. Slightly too uniform where a genuine military specification component would show the microscopic variation of precision machining at the tolerances the Navy required. She'd held enough of these components in her hands over enough years that the wrongness registered in her fingertips before it registered consciously. She checked the 4th unit, the 5th. By the 8th, she'd confirmed it across every unit in the rack. The control valves weren't Navy specification components. They were aftermarket. Civilian grade, probably sourced from a marine supply chain that had nothing to do with military oxygen management systems. Someone had installed them, documented them as genuine, and put them in the rack for Thursday's exercise. Laurel set the 8th unit back in its mount with the same careful hands she'd have used setting down something fragile, and stood very still for a moment, and thought about what 12 men breathing recycled oxygen through civilian-grade control valves under 40 feet of ice would look like when the components failed. She knew what it looked like. She had a specific memory of what it looked like, and it was not a memory she could access without cost. She pushed it back down and took out her notebook. She found Miles Rowan in the equipment storage room adjacent to the maintenance bay, running inventory on cold-weather dive suits with the systematic focus of someone who used thoroughness as a form of anxiety management. He was 27, according to the personnel roster she'd reviewed, and he had the look of someone who'd been carrying a weight he wasn't supposed to be carrying for long enough that it had started changing his posture. "Petty Officer Rowan," she said. He looked up. He'd seen her in the hallways that morning and had the same reaction. Most of the enlisted personnel had a brief, uncertain assessment, followed by the conclusion that she was administrative and therefore not his immediate concern. "Yes, ma'am. You're the lead equipment technician for Thursday's exercise." "Yes." Ma'am, you've done the pre-exercise inspection on the rebreather units. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a small tightening around the eyes that someone trained to read faces would catch, and someone not trained to read faces would miss entirely. Yes, ma'am. Walk me through what you found, Laurel said. Miles looked at his inventory clipboard. He looked at the door behind her. He looked at his clipboard again. The units are within operational parameters, he said carefully. That's what the paperwork says. Laurel kept her voice quiet. She'd positioned herself so her back was to the door, which gave Miles a clear line of sight to anyone approaching and gave her a clear read of his face. I'm asking what you found. A long pause. The kind of pause that tells you someone is making a decision about whether to trust a stranger with something that has already cost them something. I flagged the control valve assemblies, Miles said finally. 6 weeks ago and again 3 weeks ago. He stopped. What happened? Captain Vance called me into his office. Miles's voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when someone is reciting something they've rehearsed the telling of. He told me my inspection methodology was flawed. He told me the components met specification. He told me if I filed another report questioning certified equipment, he'd have me reassigned with a negative evaluation that would follow me for the rest of my career. He looked at her directly for the first time. He also told me those components were personally certified by him, and that any further questions about them were a direct challenge to his professional judgment. Did he tell you where the components came from? He told me they came from an approved military contractor. He showed me a purchase order. Did the purchase order have a contract number? Another pause. Smaller, this time the pause of someone realizing a question they should have thought to ask. I don't remember. It's all right, Laurel said. You did the right thing by reporting it. Twice. It didn't accomplish anything. It will. Miles studied her. She could see him recalibrating, trying to figure out who she actually was. Why a civilian safety specialist was asking the right questions in the right order. Why she didn't seem worried about Captain Vance's authority, the way everyone else seemed worried about Captain Vance's authority. Ma'am, he said slowly. Who are you? Someone who's going to make sure those units aren't in the water on Thursday, Laurel said. That's all you need to know right now. She spent the afternoon in the administrative records room, where her credentials gave her legitimate access to facility maintenance logs going back 3 years. What she found there was more than she'd expected and worse than she'd feared. The falsified records weren't limited to the rebreather control valves. They were part of a pattern, a systematic replacement of military specification components with civilian-grade substitutes across multiple equipment categories, documented as genuine by a single approving authority on every falsified record. Captain Douglas Vance, every time, his signature, his certification, his documented authorization. 19 separate inspection records across the past 14 months, all fraudulent, all bearing his name. The substituted components spanned rebreathers, emergency oxygen systems, and cold water dry suppressor valves, every category of life support equipment involved in Thursday's exercise. Laurel built the case in her notebook, cross-referencing serial numbers against the facility's official receiving records and finding the gaps where the genuine components had been received and then quietly replaced before reaching the maintenance bay. She documented everything twice, photographed the key pages with her phone, and encrypted the files to a secure server she accessed through a VPN that routed through 3 countries before resolving. By the time she finished, the daylight was gone and the facility had shifted into its evening rhythm, the particular quiet of a remote military installation in winter, where the darkness outside made the lit windows feel more isolated than they actually were. She was crossing the main corridor toward the dormitory wing when Harlan came around the corner from the opposite direction and nearly walked into her. He stopped. She stopped. They stood in the corridor with 18 inches of cold air between them, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Miss Kane, he said, Commander. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since that morning, like a puzzle he hadn't decided was worth solving. You didn't go to the supply office. I completed my safety documentation review, she said. The supply office will be tomorrow. You were in the maintenance bay, part of the safety audit. The maintenance bay isn't in your access authorization. The safety documentation mandate covers all equipment directly involved in Thursday's exercise. I checked with the base JAG office this afternoon to confirm the scope of my authorization. She paused. Would you like to see their written confirmation? Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding whether to push it, whether to make the call tonight and have her removed, or whether something about the specificity of her response made him hesitant. Stay out of the maintenance bay, he said. Of course. Commander, I have everything I need from it. She walked past him. She felt his eyes on her back for the length of the corridor. The pool qualification happened the following morning. And it happened because Harlan engineered it. Laurel was in the observation area above the training pool, legitimately there, observing the pre-exercise safety procedures as part of her audit when Harlan appeared beside her with two of his senior operators, and the particular casual energy of someone who has planned something and is pretending he hasn't. "Ms. Kane," he said pleasantly, "since you've been so helpful reviewing our safety procedures, I wonder if you'd be willing to help us demonstrate one." The observation area was glass-walled above a 25-meter pool that had been chilled to simulate Arctic water temperature. Below, 3 SEAL instructors were running candidates through underwater emergency drills. "What kind of demonstration?" Laurel said. "Emergency ascent protocol. One of the standard safety procedures for cold water operations. We like to make sure everyone who observes Arctic dive operations understands what they're looking at." He smiled. The smile had the particular quality of a trap that's already sprung. "It's a standard safety familiarization. Your mandate covers it." She looked at him. She understood exactly what he was doing. If she refused, she looked afraid a civilian who'd spent 2 days questioning SEAL operational decisions but wouldn't get in the water. If she accepted and failed, she'd never question anything in this facility again. "Either way, he won all right," she said. Harlan's smile widened slightly. He hadn't expected that. They gave her a wetsuit that was one size too large and equipment she hadn't seen before, a standard configuration. Nothing remarkable on the surface. She checked the regulator, checked the tank pressure, checked the BC connectors. Everything appeared functional. She noted that the SEAL instructor who helped her suit up a thick-necked man named Carver, who hadn't looked at her directly once since she arrived, spent slightly longer than necessary adjusting her equipment harness. She filed that observation away. The water was 38 degrees. She felt it through the wetsuit immediately, not as pain but as information. Her nervous system cataloging it the way it always had. The way it had been doing since the first time she'd submerged in Arctic temperature water at Bud Asace and discovered that the cold wasn't something you defeated, it was something you negotiated with. She descended to the pool floor. 12 feet. The underwater lights made everything blue and sharp. 2 minutes in, the restraint activated. It wasn't dramatic. Carver had adjusted her equipment harness so that a secondary line, nearly invisible against the black neoprene of the wetsuit, connected her BC to a weighted anchor point on the pool floor. When she moved toward the surface, it caught. Not hard enough resistance to create panic in someone who didn't understand what was happening, enough to make someone thrash, burn through their air, and surface in distress. Laurel stopped moving immediately. She floated at neutral buoyancy 3 feet above the pool floor and ran through the problem with the part of her mind that existed specifically to run through problems in situations where running through problems was the only thing standing between her and a very bad outcome. She found the secondary line in 11 seconds, traced it with her fingers to the anchor point. The carabiner connecting it to her harness was a simple gate mechanism, the kind you could open with one hand if you knew it was there. She opened it, set the anchor aside, checked her air supply. She had 90 seconds before she needed to surface. She used 40 of them. She found Carver's second modification, a pinched hose on the BC inflator that would prevent her from controlling her buoyancy precisely, making any ascent appear uncontrolled and panicked. She bypassed it manually, using her forearm to maintain constant pressure on the BC while she controlled buoyancy through breath alone. She surfaced, not gasping, not clutching the pool edge. She surfaced the way she always surfaced, with a controlled exhale and a clean breath and complete physical composure, and looked up at the observation window where Harlan was watching. Below her in the water, she registered another diver, a training candidate who'd been in the pool for the same exercise, who'd caught a genuine equipment problem and was spiraling. She looked at him. She looked at the instructors on the pool deck, who were watching her and had not yet registered the candidate's distress. She went back under. She reached the candidate in 4 seconds, stabilized him, got him oriented, shared her regulator for 2 breaths while she checked his equipment. He'd panicked and burned most of his air. She brought him to the surface controlled, keeping his body above hers, breaking his emergence first and then surfacing behind him. The pool deck was very quiet by the time she climbed out. Harlan was standing at the water's edge. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, not hostility, not the dismissive calculation of that morning's briefing room, something closer to the look of a man who has just been shown a piece of information that doesn't fit the map he's been using. "You studied the manual," he said. It wasn't really a question. "I did," Laurel said. She was pulling off her gloves. Her hands were steady. "Your candidate needs warm fluids and an equipment check. The intake valve on his stage bottle is partially obstructed." She walked past him to the locker room without waiting for a response. Behind her, she heard Senior Chief Nathan Dugan say quietly, not to her, To no one in particular, that woman did not learn that from any manual. She found the roster discrepancy at 11:40 that night. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She'd been cross-referencing the exercise documentation against the maintenance records she'd built during the day, looking for additional evidence of Vance's component substitutions, when the exercise roster came up in the system and she pulled it on reflex. 12 names. Thursday's dive exercise. All 12 were personnel from Harlan's detachment, the men who'd been in the briefing room that first morning, the men who'd watched Harlan take the folder from her hands, the men who'd smiled when someone suggested she go find forms to organize. All 12 were assigned to rebreather units from the rack she'd examined in the maintenance bay. The 12 units with the counterfeit control valves. She sat with that for a moment, felt its full weight. This wasn't abstract anymore, a documentation problem, an evidence pattern, a fraud case building toward eventual accountability. It was 12 specific men and a timestamp of 36 hours, and equipment that would fail under the ice because someone had decided the difference between military-grade and civilian-grade oxygen management systems was worth the money they could pocket by making the substitution. She thought about the pressure ridge on the infiltration route, the one she'd identified in the briefing room before Harlan took the folder from her hands. She made her decision. She found Harlan in the operations room at midnight. He was alone, reviewing weather data for Thursday's window, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He looked up when she entered. He didn't say anything immediately, just waited, with the patience of a man who'd decided she was going to surprise him again and had accepted that as a condition of her existence at his facility. "Commander," she said, "I need you to postpone Thursday's exercise." Harlan set down the weather printout. Kane 12 rebreather units are currently racked for Thursday's dive. All 12 have counterfeit control valve assemblies. They're not military specification. They're civilian-grade components that have been documented as genuine by a falsified certification chain. She kept her voice completely level. She wasn't performing anything. She was delivering information. Under ice conditions at the temperatures projected for Thursday, those components have a significant probability of failure. Not a meaningful probability, a significant one. Talking simultaneous failure across multiple units in a closed water environment with limited extraction options. Harlan said nothing. "I've documented the evidence. I have serial number cross-references, receiving records showing the original components, and maintenance logs bearing Captain Vance's certification signature across 19 separate fraudulent inspections." She paused. "I also have recorded testimony from the equipment technician who tried to report this 6 weeks ago and was threatened with career termination by Captain Vance for doing so." The silence in the operations room was the particular quality of silence that falls when someone is deciding whether the thing they've just heard can possibly be real. "That's a serious accusation," Harlan said finally. "It's a documented finding. Against my base logistics chief. Yes, based on your personal inspection of equipment you weren't authorized to access. Based on a safety audit conducted under my facility mandate, which I confirmed with the base JAG office." She looked at him steadily. "Commander, I need you to postpone this exercise. Not indefinitely. 24 hours while the components are replaced with verified military specification parts and the full maintenance record is audited by someone other than Vance." Harlan stood up. He was taller than her by nearly a foot and broader by the kind of margin that comes from 20 years of physical training. And he used the height the way she'd seen him use everything, as an expression of authority, a physical argument for his position in the hierarchy. "Rear Admiral Shaw is arriving Thursday morning to observe this exercise. My unit's deployment readiness evaluation depends on this exercise proceeding. I understand that. If I go to the Admiral and tell him I'm postponing because a civilian safety specialist found a documentation problem, tell him you postponed because your equipment technician identified a safety risk that your logistics chief suppressed, and that the risk has been independently confirmed and documented." She stepped forward, not aggressively, just closing the distance that he kept using to make his physical argument. "Tell him you made the right call. That's a better story than what happens if those units fail Thursday." Harlan looked at her. She could see him working through it, the calculation, the career arithmetic, the weight of Rear Admiral Shaw's arrival against the weight of what she'd just told him, the fundamental question of whether he believed her. And she could see, just below the surface of that calculation, the other thing, the thing he didn't want to look at, the thing that had been there since the pool, since she'd surfaced without gasping, since she'd gone back under for the struggling candidate, since Dugan had said what he'd said quietly to no one in particular. The question of who she actually was. "You're asking me to trust a civilian I've known for 2 days over a senior officer I've known for 3 years," he said. I'm asking you to trust the documentation. The civilian is just the one who found it. Another silence. Then Harlan said, "Show me the serial number cross-references." It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and in the space between those two things, 12 men were still breathing on the surface, which was the only thing that mattered. Laurel opened her notebook and began. They sat in the operations room until 2 in the morning. Harlan went through every document she'd compiled, the serial numbers, the receiving records, the maintenance logs, the falsified certification signature, the photograph evidence, the cross-references that proved what the components were and weren't. He was methodical about it, in the way she recognized from the pool a man who was genuinely good at what he did, whose professional instincts were sound, even when his personal ones weren't, working through information with the systematic care of someone who understood that getting this wrong had consequences he couldn't live with. At 1:45, he set down the last photograph and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. 19 inspections, he said finally, across 14 months. The component substitution pattern suggests it started shortly after Vance took the logistics position. He was recommended by 3 flag officers. Fraud usually is, Laurel said. Harlan rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man absorbing something he hadn't prepared himself to absorb. If this is right, my unit has been operating with compromised equipment across 14 months of training cycles. Yes, and Miles Rowan flagged it twice. Yes, the weight of that settled over him, visibly not collapsing him, but landing on him with the full force of its implication. A 27-year-old equipment technician had seen what he hadn't seen, had reported it and been silenced while Harlan ran exercises and reviewed weather windows and prepared for Rear Admiral Shaw's visit. "I need to make a call," he said. "I know." He reached for the secure phone. Then he stopped. He looked at her across the operations table, with the documents between them and the cold, coming through the walls and the weight of 36 hours pressing down on everything. "Who are you?" he said, not aggressively, not with the dismissive edge of that morning's briefing room, with something that sounded for the first time like a genuine question from a man who wanted a genuine answer. Laurel looked at him. "Someone who doesn't want to find out what happens if those units go in the water Thursday," she said. "Make the call, Commander." She watched him pick up the phone, and she understood that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning to become itself. The evidence was built. The corruption was documented. But the ice was still out there and the exercise was still 36 hours away. And somewhere in this facility, Captain Douglas Vance did not yet know that his falsification chain had been unraveled by a woman he'd never bothered to look at twice. That was about to change. Harlan made the call at 2:17 in the morning. Laurel heard him through the operations room wall, not the words, just the cadence, the particular rhythm of a senior officer delivering information he didn't want to deliver to someone above him in the chain. She sat in the corridor outside with her notebook on her knee and her back against the cold metal wall and waited. The call lasted 9 minutes. When Harlan came out, he looked like a man who had just handed something heavy to someone else and wasn't sure yet whether that was relief or surrender. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Someone's coming in the morning. Until then, nothing moves. The exercise roster is frozen. The rebreather units need to be pulled from the rack," Laurel said. "Tonight. Before anyone has access to them." I said, "Nothing moves. Those units are evidence. If Vance finds out his certification chain has been compromised, the first thing he does is the evidence. You need those units secured before morning." Harlan looked at her with the particular expression of a man who kept discovering that the next thing she said was going to require him to do something he hadn't planned to do. He turned back into the operations room without answering. She heard him pick up the phone again. 20 minutes later, Senior Chief Nathan Dugan arrived at the maintenance bay with 2 operators she didn't recognize and a direct order from Harlan to secure and log every piece of exercise equipment in the rack. Dugan did it without asking why. That told her something important about him. She watched from the doorway as he worked, moving through the task with the efficiency of a man who understood that sometimes the reason for an order mattered less than getting the order done correctly. He was 56 or close to it, with the kind of physical presence that doesn't come from size alone, but from the specific density of someone who has spent decades doing difficult things in difficult places and has made peace with all of it. The men under him worked faster when he was watching. Not because they were afraid of him, but because his standard was visible, and they wanted to meet it. When the last unit was logged and secured, Dugan dismissed the 2 operators and stood in the maintenance bay alone for a moment. Then he looked at the doorway, at her. "You want to tell me what I just secured 12 rebreather units against?" he said. "Evidence preservation," Laurel said. "Evidence of what?" "A fraud case that's going to be uncomfortable for several people at this facility." Dugan studied her. He had the eyes of someone who'd been reading people in high-stakes situations for 30 years, not suspicious eyes, just accurate ones. "You're not a safety specialist," he said. "It wasn't a question. I have the credentials. I've seen safety specialists. I've worked with them. I've watched them do pool walkthroughs and equipment checks and fire extinguisher audits." He paused. "I've never seen one do what you did in that pool today." Laurel didn't say anything. "That candidate you pulled," Dugan said, "Gentry. 23 years old, 8 months out of Buttoness. He's been telling people since this afternoon that the civilian lady saved his life." Another pause. "He's not wrong, is he? He needed help. I was there. You went back under after surfacing clean from a restraint evolution." Without being told to, without hesitation, Dugan folded his arms across his chest. "I've been in naval special warfare for 28 years. I've seen a lot of people in the water. What you did today, the way you moved, the way you read the situation, the way you managed the ascent, that is not something you learn from a manual." The maintenance bay was quiet around them, cold. The secured rebreather units were lined against the wall in a row, tagged and logged. The counterfeit control valves locked inside them like evidence in a case that hadn't been formally opened yet. "Senior Chief," Laurel said, "I need you to trust me for about 36 more hours. Can you do that?" Dugan looked at her for a long moment. "I've been trusting you since the pool," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I know." He walked out. She stood in the maintenance bay alone with the evidence and the cold and the weight of everything that still had to happen before Thursday. Captain Douglas Vance arrived at the facility at 0700 the following morning, which was his standard time, and he was in his standard morning configuration, coffee in hand, expression calibrated to project administrative authority. The unhurried confidence of a man who believed his position was secure, because it had been secure for 14 months, and there was no apparent reason for that to change. Laurel watched him cross the main corridor from the window of the administrative records room, where she'd been working since 5:30. She'd slept 3 hours. She felt fine. She'd operated on less. She watched Vance stop at the operations desk, exchange brief words with the duty officer, and continue toward his office. His pace was normal. His body language was normal. He didn't know yet. She had maybe 2 hours before he found out. She went back to the records. What she was looking for now was the financial thread, the purchase orders, the contractor invoices, the payment records that would show not just that the components were counterfeit, but that someone had been paid to make them appear genuine. Fraud at this scale didn't happen in a vacuum. Someone supplied the components. Someone issued the purchase orders. Someone received the payments. And somewhere in those transactions was the proof that this wasn't negligence or error but deliberate criminal action. She found the first thread at 0740. It was a purchase order from 11 months ago, issued under Vance's authorization for a single line item described as oxygen control valve assembly. Ulspec quantity 12. The receiving contractor was listed as Northland Defense Supply, LLC, a name she'd seen in the legitimate receiving records for previous equipment orders. But the contract number was wrong. Not falsified, wrong. A transposition of 2 digits that would have been caught in any standard audit, but had apparently slipped through because someone in the approval chain had stopped looking carefully. She cross-referenced the contract number. It resolved to a different contractor, entirely a marine equipment supplier based in Anchorage with no military contract history. She cross-referenced Northland Defense Supply, LLC. It had been registered in Delaware 14 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm that specialized in shell company administration. Its listed principals were 2 names she didn't recognize. She searched both names in the base's personnel system. One of them didn't appear, the other one appeared once, in a facilities access log from 8 months ago. The log entry showed a visitor badge issued to a man named Gerald Vance, signed in by Captain Douglas Vance, listed as a personal guest. Facility tour. She sat with that for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single encrypted message to the secure server she'd been routing through since she arrived. The message said, "Shell Company, family connection. Accelerate timeline." The response came back in under 2 minutes. Confirmed. Asset arriving 1100. She found Miles in the equipment storage room at 8:15, running the same inventory he'd been running when she found him the day before. She wondered if he ran inventory when he was anxious the way other people paced, or went for walks, something to do with his hands while his mind worked through things it couldn't resolve. "They secured the units last night," he said when she came in. He said it quietly, like information he was still deciding what to do with. "Senior Chief Dugan. Direct order from Commander Harlan." Miles looked at her. "What happened?" Commander Harlan reviewed the documentation and made the right call. She paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it as completely as you can." When you filed your first report 6 weeks ago, the one Captain Vance told you to withdraw, did you keep a copy? Miles's hands went still on the inventory clipboard. I was told to destroy it. Did you? A silence. The kind that answers the question before the words do. I scanned it, he said finally. I sent the scan to my personal email. I knew I wasn't supposed to. I knew if Vance found out, I couldn't make myself delete it. 12 guys going in the water with those components. I couldn't. That document is now the most important piece of evidence in a federal fraud investigation, Laurel said. I need you to forward it to an address I'm going to give you. It's encrypted right now from your personal phone, not the base network. Miles stared at her. The calculation on his face was visible, the weight of what she was asking, against the weight of everything he'd been carrying for 6 weeks. The reports he'd filed and had taken from him, the threat Vance had made. The image he'd been living with of 12 men under 40 feet of ice with equipment he knew was wrong. Who are you sending it to, he said. Someone who can use it. That's not an answer. It's the answer I can give you right now. She looked at him steadily. Miles, you tried to do the right thing twice. Both times it was taken from you. I'm asking you to try one more time, and this time I promise you it won't be taken. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone. Vance found out at 9:40. Laurel knew the exact moment because she was in the administrative records room when she heard his voice in the corridor raised. Controlled, but carrying the particular edge of a man who has just been informed that a locked door he relied on is no longer locked. She heard Harlan's voice responding, lower, shorter. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She knew the shape of the conversation. She saved what she was working on, closed the files, and moved to the doorway. Vance was standing 20 feet down the corridor, facing Harlan. He was a large man, 51, broad-shouldered, with the kind of authority that comes from spending 30 years in rooms where his rank was the highest rank. He was holding himself with deliberate control, which told her that whatever he was feeling, he was managing it, which told her that he was thinking rather than reacting, which meant he was already calculating his next move rather than absorbing the damage. That was more dangerous than anger. The units were secured on my direct order, Harlan said, pending a review of the maintenance records. On what basis, Vance said. Safety documentation findings flagged during the facility audit. What findings? Serial number discrepancies across the control valve assemblies. Cross-referenced against receiving records. Harlan's voice was steady. She could hear that it cost him something to keep it that way. The documentation suggests the installed components may not match the certified specifications. May not match. Vance's voice landed on those words with the particular precision of a man reframing information in real time. Bryce, those units were personally certified by me under military inspection protocol. If there's a serial number discrepancy, it's a data entry error. These things happen. You pull a unit, you run a physical inspection. You confirm the certification, you put it back. He paused. You don't freeze an exercise 48 hours before Admiral Shaw arrives over a paperwork issue flagged by a civilian administrator. It's not a paperwork issue, then what is it? A beat. She could see Harlan from the corridor, his posture, the set of his shoulders, the calculation running behind his eyes. I'd like you to come to the operations room, Harlan said. I want to walk you through the documentation. Vance looked at him for a moment. Then he said, of course. And his voice had gone smooth in a way that told her he'd already decided what he was going to do when he got there. She stepped back from the doorway and went to find Dugan. She found him in the armory, which was where he apparently went when he needed to think, methodically cleaning equipment that was already clean, the physical rhythm of it doing something useful for his mental process. He looked up when she came in and read her face immediately. Vance knows, he said. He's with Harlan now. She pulled the door closed behind her. Senior Chief, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without asking questions I can't answer yet. Dugan set down the equipment he was holding. Go ahead. The fraud case is solid. The documentation is complete. There's a federal asset arriving at 1100 to take custody of the evidence and initiate formal proceedings. She paused. But Vance is smart, and he's had 14 months to build himself an exit. He will attempt to destroy the maintenance database before he leaves that operations room. If he succeeds, we lose the falsified inspection records, the documentation that proves the substitution was systematic and deliberate, not an isolated error. Dugan didn't move. What do you need? I need someone in the operations room who outranks Vance's ability to clear the space. Someone he can't order out. She looked at him. That's not me. Not yet. Dugan stood up. He was already moving before she finished the sentence, which was why she'd come to him instead of anyone else. Not yet, he repeated. The way he said it made it clear that he'd heard the implication and filed it away. He didn't ask, he just moved. She followed him down the corridor toward the operations room, 2 steps behind and to his right, which put her close enough to act and far enough back to be overlooked by anyone whose attention was fixed on Dugan. They came through the operations room door at the same time. Vance reached the database terminal. He had his hand on the keyboard. His access credentials were already entered. She could see the cursor blinking in the command field. The instruction half-typed, the particular posture of someone who has committed to an action and is executing it. Captain Vance, Dugan's voice filled the room, not loud. Just absolute. The voice of a man who had been in the Navy for 28 years and had learned exactly how much volume authority actually required. Step back from the terminal. Vance turned. He took in Dugan. He took in Laurel behind him. Something moved behind his eyes, the rapid recalculation of a man who had expected to find more time than he'd found. Senior Chief, this doesn't concern you. Every piece of evidence in this facility concerning Thursday's exercise concerns me, Dugan said. Step back from the terminal, sir. The sir landed with the particular weight of a word used correctly in a context where correctness was itself a challenge. Vance's hand didn't move. Harlan, who had been standing to the right of the terminal, said quietly, "Don't." The room held. Vance looked at Harlan. He looked at Dugan. He looked at Laurel, and for the first time since she'd arrived at this facility, he looked at her with the focused attention of a man who had just identified the actual threat in the room. "Who are you?" he said. It was the second time in 24 hours she'd been asked that question. Both times she'd given the same answer. "Someone who got here before you did," she said. Vance's hand came off the keyboard. He stepped back from the terminal. Not because he'd given up, she could see that clearly, but because he'd made a new calculation, found a new angle, and decided that the database wasn't the move anymore. She'd anticipated that too. While Dugan held the room, she crossed to the terminal in 4 steps, pulled a secure drive from her jacket pocket, and copied the complete maintenance database in 45 seconds. She ejected the drive. She put it back in her pocket. Then she looked at Vance. "It's already gone," she said. "The copy is already off-site. Everything you've done for the past 14 months is documented, preserved, and in federal hands." She paused. "Destroying the terminal won't change that." Vance looked at her with an expression she recognized from very specific operational contexts, the expression of a man who realized he has already lost but hasn't yet decided whether to accept that or make it worse. He made it worse. He moved fast for a 51-year-old man, faster than Harlan expected, faster than the duty officer at the far desk expected. He went for the door. Not running, just moving with the decisive physicality of someone who had decided that distance was his remaining option. That if he could get out of this room and off this facility and into the civilian transportation infrastructure of Kodiak Island, he could buy himself enough time to. Dugan caught him at the door. Not dramatically. Not with force. Just stepped into the space between Vance and the exit with the particular immovability of someone who weighed 220 pounds and had spent 3 decades learning exactly how to occupy a doorway. Vance stopped. He was breathing harder than he'd been 30 seconds ago. Harlan said, very quietly, "It's over, Doug." The room held that for a moment. The specific quality of a moment when something that has been in motion for a long time finally stops. Vance looked at Harlan. Something crossed his face that might have been, in another life, something like shame, then it closed off again. "I want a lawyer," he said. "The federal asset arriving at 1100 will accommodate that," Laurel said. He arrived at 10:58, a man in civilian clothes, who carried federal credentials and said almost nothing to anyone except Laurel, to whom he said a series of quiet, precise things in a hallway near the operations room, while Vance sat under Dugan's supervision, and Harlan stood in his own facility feeling the ground shift under his feet in ways he was still trying to understand. Laurel handed over the secure drive. She handed over the encrypted files she'd routed off-site the previous night. She handed over Miles's scanned original report and the shell company documentation and the personnel access log showing Gerald Vance's visit 8 months ago. The federal agent looked at everything she'd given him and said, "This is thorough." "It needed to be," she said. "How long on site?" 62 hours, he looked at her. He'd worked with her before, which meant he knew what 62 hours meant in her operational context, and understood that it was not ace boat, but simply a fact delivered without emphasis because emphasis would have been unnecessary. "The exercise is still scheduled, postponed pending equipment certification. Admiral Shaw arrives Thursday morning. It's his call whether to proceed. The units, secured in the maintenance bay. Chain of custody intact. Dugan logged them personally. Good, he put the materials into a secure... We'll need formal statements from Rowan. He knows. He's ready." The agent nodded. He looked at her once, but particular look of someone who wants to say something and has decided the situation doesn't require it. Then he walked toward the operations room and the part of this that became other people's job. Laurel stood in the hallway alone for a moment. 62 hours. She'd been on this base for 62 hours and Vance was in custody, and the evidence was secured, and 12 men were still breathing on the surface. That was what mattered. That was the entire thing. She felt the exhaustion then, not during, never during, but after, the way it always came after. The 3 hours of sleep and the pool and the midnight operations room and the corridor this morning and Vance's hand on the keyboard. She felt all of it land at once, the specific weight of sustained high-stakes operation, in a cover that required her to be invisible while doing the most visible things, and she breathed through it the way she breathed through the cold water, not fighting it, just acknowledging it and continuing. Harlan found her 20 minutes later. He came around the corner of the corridor and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment just stood there with the particular look of a man who has too many things to say and not enough certainty about which one goes first. "Vance is in federal custody," he said finally. "Yes, they're telling me the fraud goes back 14 months. 19 inspections. Yes, and Rowan flagged it twice. What he said, that one def flatter fake, with a specific quality of weight behind it that told her it had been sitting on him since 2 in the morning and hadn't gotten lighter. I've been running this detachment for 2 years. Miles Rowan reported a safety risk to my logistics chief twice in 6 weeks. I never heard a word about it. Vance made sure you wouldn't. That's not," he started again, "that's not good enough. As the commanding officer of this unit, my people should be able to report safety risks without going through a single choke point that one corrupt officer can control." His jaw tightened. "I built that structure. I trusted that structure." Laurel looked at him. She'd been watching him process this since 2 in the morning, and she understood what she was seeing, not a bad officer having a revelation, but a good officer confronting the specific gap between how good he thought he was and how good he actually needed to be. Those were different things, and the gap between them was where people died. "You made the right call last night," she said, "after you spent 2 days trying to make it for me." Yes, the directness of that landed on him. He absorbed it without flinching, which told her something she filed away. "The pool," he said. "Carver rigged your equipment. Yes, I didn't order that, I know. But I created a culture where someone thought humiliating you was acceptable, where it was entertainment." He looked at her with the steady gaze of a man making himself look at something he'd rather not. "You went back under for Gentry after that. After what we'd just done to you, Gentry needed help," Laurel said. "What you did to me had nothing to do with what he needed." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "I called you sweetheart," he said, "in front of my entire unit. On your first morning. Yes, you did. I took the folder out of your hands. Yes, you'd already identified the pressure ridge. I had." He looked at the wall. Not away from her, just at something that wasn't her face. Because looking at her face while absorbing all of this was apparently one thing too many at once. "How long have you known about that ridge?" 7 years, Laurel said. "Give or take." Something shifted in his expression. A question forming that he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "2 of my teammates," she said before he could. "February. 7 years ago. Different facility, same failure mode, a route that crossed a pressure ridge that had been assessed and signed off on by people who were certain the ice would hold." She paused. "Didn't." The corridor was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Harlan said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. That it wasn't the automatic condolence of someone moving through a required social gesture, but something he was actually feeling. Possibly for the first time in this conversation. "So am I," she said. Every day. She let that sit for a moment, then, "Commander, the exercise is still postponed, but Admiral Shaw is still arriving Thursday morning. When he does, your unit needs to be ready to give him an honest accounting of what happened here, not a managed version. Not a version designed to minimize the leadership exposure, but an honest one, including Rowan, including the pool, including your unit culture." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" Harlan was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Then start preparing." She moved past him down the corridor. She was nearly at the far door when he said, "Miss Kane." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "Whatever your actual mandate is," he said. "Whatever you actually are. I'm glad you were here." She stood there for one breath. 2. "So are 12 men who don't know it yet," she said. She pushed through the door and walked out into the cold. Miles Rowan found her that afternoon in the administrative records room, where she was completing the final documentation for federal handoff. He came in without knocking, which was new when she'd first found him in the equipment storage room. He'd had the posture of someone who knocked carefully and waited to be acknowledged. Something had shifted in his bearing since this morning. "They took his credentials," Miles said. "Vance. They walked him out past the front desk without his base credentials." "Yes, and the report I filed, the original one. It's going to be part of the federal case?" "Both reports." "Yes." Miles stood in the doorway for a moment, processing that. "He threatened my career," he said. "He told me if I filed another report he'd end my career." "I know, and now he's in federal custody." "Yes." Miles looked at her. Something moved across his face, not triumph, nothing as simple as that, but the particular release of a weight that has been carried for long enough that its absence feels strange. I almost deleted the scan, he said, 3 times. I had it open on my phone and I almost deleted it because I was scared. He was a captain, I'm a petty officer in this system. That math doesn't usually end well for me. You didn't delete it, Laurel said. No, a pause, because I kept seeing those 12 guys going under the ice. She looked at him across the records room, this 27-year-old technician who had done the right thing twice when it cost him something and had held on to the evidence when holding on to it was the scared and difficult and correct choice. Miles, she said, what you did matters, not just for this case. The fact that you saw the problem and reported it and kept the record when someone tried to make you destroy it, that matters. That's what this facility is supposed to run on. Miles nodded. He was holding himself differently than he had yesterday, still young, still junior, but with the particular straightness of someone who has been told that what they did was correct and has decided to believe it. Who are you, he said. It was the 3rd time she'd been asked it in 36 hours. This time the question had a different quality, not suspicious, not calculating, just honest, just a young man who had trusted a stranger on instinct and wanted to understand what he'd trusted. Someone who needed you to hold on to that scan, Laurel said. That's the truest answer I can give you right now. He accepted it. He nodded once and turned to leave. At the door he stopped. The exercise, he said. If they replace the components and recertify the units, is it safe? Thursday? She looked at him. That depends on the route, she said. And Miles Rowan, 27 years old, 8 months removed from the equipment storage room where people had stopped listening to him, looked back at her and said, then someone needs to fix the route. She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said, they do. He left. She turned back to the records. Outside, the Alaskan afternoon was already going dark, and somewhere across the frozen coastline, 12 men who didn't know any of this had happened were running PT and eating dinner and doing all the ordinary things people do when they don't know how close they came. 36 hours left until Admiral Shaw arrived. Laurel Kane picked up her pen and went back to work. The replacement components arrived at 0600 Wednesday morning on a Navy logistics flight out of Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, 12 military specification oxygen control valve assemblies, each serial number verified against the DOD procurement database before the flight left Anchorage. Miles was on the tarmac when the crate came off the aircraft. He checked every unit personally, running the verification protocol twice, writing down each number in his own handwriting in his own notebook before signing the receiving log. Harlan stood 10 feet behind him and watched the whole thing without saying a word. When Miles finished and straightened up and turned around, Harlan looked at him for a moment and then said, "Good work, Petty Officer Rowan." It was 3 words. Miles looked like someone had handed him something he'd been waiting a long time to receive. He nodded once, said yes sir, and went back to the crate. Laurel watched from the edge of the tarmac. She'd been awake since 4:30, running the logistics of the next 24 hours through her head the way she ran everything systematically, without sentimentality, with the particular focus of someone who understood that the gap between planning and execution was where things went wrong. The components were right. The maintenance database was preserved and in federal hands. Vance was in custody. Miles had documentation back. What remained was the route. She'd been building the case for the route change since she first saw Harlan's red grease pencil line on the tactical map 2 days ago now, though it felt like a week compressed into a series of moments, each one demanding full attention and leaving no room for anything else. She had the geological survey data. She had the pressure analysis. She had the historical records from the 2019 incident that Harlan didn't know she'd been part of. What she didn't have was authorization to change anything. That authorization belonged to Harlan. And after Thursday morning, it would belong to Rear Admiral Shaw. She needed Harlan to change the route before Shaw arrived. If he didn't, if the exercise proceeded with the original infiltration path crossing the unstable pressure ridge, then the rebreather units could be perfect, the components could be flawless, and she would still be standing on the surface, watching 12 men go under ice that wasn't going to hold. She needed one more conversation with Harlan. She got it at 0800, in the operations room, with the tactical map between them, and the corrected maintenance logs stacked to the side, and the weight of everything that had happened in the past 60 hours present in the room like a third person. She walked him through the geological data point by point. She showed him the pressure ridge survey. She showed him the temperature projections for Thursday and what they meant for ice behavior in the specific section his route crossed. She was precise and direct, and she did not soften anything, because he'd earned the full truth, and softening it would have been a form of disrespect. Harlan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the map for a long moment. He picked up the grease pencil. He drew a new line longer, adding approximately 400 meters to the infiltration route, curving south to avoid the ridge entirely before rejoining the original path at checkpoint 3. He set the pencil down. "That's the route," he said. Laurel looked at the new line. It was correct. It avoided every instability she'd identified. It was longer and harder and would push the team's timing on the extraction window, but it was survivable. "Yes," she said. "That's the route." Harlan looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing more frequently from him in the past 24 hours, not the dismissive certainty of the first briefing room, not even the reluctant acknowledgement of the midnight operations session, but something more like the look of a man who has started genuinely trying to see something he previously chose not to see. "Is there anything else?" "No," she said. "You've got it." She meant that in more ways than one, and something in his face suggested he understood that. Admiral Shaw's aircraft touched down at 0940 Thursday morning. Laurel was not on the tarmac for the arrival. She was in the administrative records room, completing the final piece of documentation she needed. When she heard the aircraft overhead, she listened to it land. She gave herself 30 seconds to feel what she felt, which was a specific tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the understanding that the next several hours were going to require her to be two things at once in a way that was always costly, and then she picked up her notebook and went back to work. Shaw had been briefed, she knew that. He'd received the encrypted summary she'd transmitted 48 hours ago, and the Federal Assets initial report, and Harlan's own communication from Wednesday morning. He knew the broad shape of what had happened at this facility in the past 3 days. He was arriving to observe a modified exercise with verified equipment on a corrected route, and to conduct the formal accounting that Harlan had committed to giving him. What Shaw didn't know, what nobody at this facility knew except Shaw himself, was what he was going to do when he saw her. She'd worked with Shaw 3 times in 8 years. He was the kind of admiral who remembered everything and revealed nothing until the moment he decided revelation served a purpose. She trusted him completely, which was why she'd accepted this assignment, and she had absolutely no idea what he was planning for Thursday morning. That uncertainty was the one variable she couldn't control. She went back to her documentation and let it go. The exercise began at 1100. The weather window was tighter, then projected a front moving in from the northwest that hadn't been in Wednesday's forecast, pushing winds up and dropping the effective temperature another 8 degrees below the morning reading. Harlan assessed it, consulted with his team leads, and made the call to go. The window was workable. The extraction timeline was tight but achievable. The corrected route gave them the margin they needed. Laurel stood in the command center with Dugan and 2 communications operators and watched the 12 operator markers move across the display as the team entered the water. Everything looked right. The equipment readings were clean. The team was moving on the corrected route. The extraction opening was confirmed and manned. The weather was cold but within operational parameters. For 6 minutes everything looked right. Then the first beacon went wrong. It was subtle at first, a slight drift in one operator's position marker, the kind of drift that could be signal interference or equipment movement or any of a dozen ordinary explanations. The communications operator flagged it. Dugan leaned over the display. Laurel was already at the console before either of them spoke. "That's not drift," she said. The marker was moving in a direction the operator couldn't be moving away from the team, toward the eastern ice shelf, a path that would have required swimming directly against the current. Nobody swims against the current under ice unless something has gone very wrong. "Check beacon integrity," Dugan said to the operator. The operator ran the check. His face changed. "Beacon 3 is transmitting false coordinates," he said. "The signal is real, but the position data is corrupted." Laurel felt something go cold that wasn't the temperature. "Check the others," she said. The operator ran through the sequence. 4 seconds. "Beacon 7, 9, and 11, he said. "Same issue. Position data is corrupted. They're transmitting false coordinates. 4 operators. 4 beacons transmitting fabricated positions, sending their location data to the command center as a clean signal while the actual operators were somewhere else entirely beneath the ice, somewhere the display wasn't showing." "How?" Dugan said. Dugan didn't panic, but his voice had the particular quality of controlled urgency that tells you the situation has just changed categories. Laurel was already pulling up the equipment records on the secondary console. The beacons. She hadn't checked the beacons. She'd checked the rebreathers, the control valves, the oxygen systems, but the beacons were a separate equipment category, maintained under a separate inspection protocol, logged under a separate section of the maintenance records she'd audited. The section Vance had also certified. She found it in 40 seconds. 4 beacon units, numbers 379 and 11, certified by Vance 6 weeks ago with civilian-grade GPS modules that couldn't maintain accuracy under ice conditions. They transmitted correctly on the surface. They corrupted under the electromagnetic interference of ice cover at depth. Vance had known about the beacon issue. He'd certified them anyway. The operators don't know their positions are wrong, she said. They're navigating by beacon data. They think they're en route. Dugan straightened up. What's the actual failure mode? They'll navigate to the extraction opening based on corrupted coordinates. The beacons will show them approaching the correct position while they're actually moving away from it. When they reach what their equipment tells them is the extraction point, she stopped. She didn't need to finish. Dugan had been in the water enough times to complete the calculation himself. They'll be under solid ice, he said, with no opening. An emergency oxygen running down. The command center held that for exactly 1 second. Then Harlan's voice came over the internal comm from the surface observation post. Command, I'm showing beacon irregularities on the surface display. What's your status? 4 beacons transmitting false coordinates, Dugan said into the comm. Operators are navigating on corrupted data, actual positions unknown. A pause. 3 seconds. The particular silence of a senior officer absorbing information that has just redefined his emergency. Then Harlan said, what do we have for extraction options? Laurel was already at the geological survey overlay. She pulled up the ice chart she'd memorized, not the official extraction point, but every secondary opening within the operational area. Emergency ice features, natural fractures, pressure leaf vents. She'd mapped them when she mapped the route. She'd mapped them because she always mapped them, because 7 years ago she hadn't mapped them, and 2 men had died looking for openings that she could have found for them if she'd looked before instead of after. There's a natural pressure vent 200 meters northeast of the primary extraction point, she said. It's not on the exercise chart, it's on the geological survey from last March. It should be open. The temperature profile for this section shows consistent thermal upwelling that prevents full seal. Should be, Dugan said. Should be, she confirmed. Because that was the truth and she wasn't going to make it cleaner than it was. Can we get a diver to them? Harlan's voice. Someone who knows where they actually are. Laurel looked at the ice chart. She looked at the beacon data, the corrupted positions overlaid against the actual survey topography, trying to reverse engineer where 4 operators with corrupted navigation were most likely to be based on current, entry point, and elapsed time. Her mind ran the calculation. It wasn't a simple calculation. It required integrating the current data with the temperature gradient and the team's known swimming speed and the elapsed time since beacon corruption began, and the specific behavioral pattern of operators who believe they're on course when they're not. She'd done this calculation before, not at a console in the water, in the dark in February, looking for 2 men who a beacon had told her were 40 meters to her left when they were actually 40 meters below her. She'd found one of them. She hadn't found the other in time. She was not going to be standing at a console this time. I'm going in, she said. Dugan looked at her, not surprised. Not arguing. Just reading her face to confirm she meant it the way it sounded. She meant it exactly the way it sounded. You're a civilian, the communications operator said. He was 22 and genuinely confused, and it wasn't his fault. Get me a suit, Laurel said to Dugan. Dugan moved. She suited up in 4 minutes. Dugan helped her, working fast and precise, checking each connection with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the person going in the water was the only asset they had that knew where to look. He didn't ask questions, he didn't make speeches. He checked her rebreather verified components. All military specification, Miles's handwriting on the receiving log in her beacon, and her emergency oxygen, and the ice tools she'd pulled from the emergency equipment locker. I'm going with you, he said. You need to stay on comm. Someone has to manage the surface end. I'm going with you, he said again. Not arguing. Just stating. She looked at him. She understood what he was offering and why. He was 56 years old and had 28 years in naval special warfare, and he was standing in front of her with his gear half on, and his expression completely steady, and she understood that there was no version of this conversation where he stayed on the surface. Then keep up, she said. He smiled. Just barely. I've been keeping up with you for 3 days. They went in together. The water was 37 degrees and completely dark past the first 3 feet of ice cover. Laurel felt it absorb her the way it always did, not as cold exactly. More as a renegotiation of every physical assumption her body had been operating under for the past 72 hours. Everything simplified. Everything became immediate. There was no federal case here. No tactical map, no corridor conversations, just water and pressure and the specific problem of finding 12 men before their oxygen ran out. She navigated by current first. That was the baseline, the directional truth that beacons could lie and electronics could fail, but water moved the way physics required it to move. and anyone navigating under ice in a current would be influenced by it whether they knew it or not. She felt the current's direction and magnitude and held it as her primary reference, building a mental map of where 4 operators with corrupted navigation would most likely have drifted relative to their intended route. Dugan stayed 2 body lengths behind her. She could feel his presence without seeing him, the subtle pressure displacement of another diver moving in the same water, the way you learn to read proximity in zero visibility if you spend enough time in it. 4 minutes in, she found the first one. He was 20 feet below the ice ceiling, hovering at neutral buoyancy, doing exactly what he'd been trained to do when navigation went uncertain, stopping, conserving oxygen, waiting for direction. His beacon was transmitting confidently to the surface with completely fabricated coordinates. He had no idea where he was. She put her hand on his arm. He startled the full-body flinch of someone in a high-stress environment who has just been touched by something unexpected. She felt him register her, another diver, not a threat, present and oriented. She got in front of his face and gave him the hand signal for follow and pointed in the direction she was moving. He followed. She found the second operator 6 minutes later, working her way along the ice ceiling's topographic features, the ridges and depressions that she'd memorized from the geological survey, reading them through her gloves the way you read Braille, building a 3-dimensional picture of the space that her eyes couldn't give her. The second operator was moving, still trying to navigate, following his corrupted beacon toward what he thought was the extraction point. She intercepted him, gave him the signal, added him to her line. 2 found. 2 still under. Plus the 8 operators whose beacons were clean but whose extraction was compromised by the 4 corrupted units, throwing off the team's navigation cohesion. She pushed the pace. The third operator was the one who changed everything. She found him by sound, a specific irregular rhythm in the water that didn't match current or ambient ice movement. The sound of a rebreather working too hard, because the person breathing through it was working too hard, burning oxygen at a rate that compressed the available timeline from theoretical to immediate. She reached him and understood the problem in the same moment her hands found him. He was unconscious, not hypothermic. His suit integrity was intact, but his rebreather had cycled into a fault state, and in the fault state it was delivering gas but not at the correct mixture. And the cumulative effect over the past several minutes had been exactly what that mixture imbalance always produced. She had 1 emergency oxygen supply. She used it. She shared her supply while she stabilized his rebreather, working in darkness by touch alone, finding the fault in the secondary scrubber and bypassing it manually the way she'd bypassed Carver's pinched hose in the pool, not because she'd expected this exact problem, but because she'd learned long ago that the problems you didn't expect were usually variations of problems you'd solved before. And the skill was in recognizing the variation fast enough to do something about it. The operator came back to consciousness 30 seconds later. She felt him register her, the same startled recognition, the same rapid reorientation of a trained mind processing unexpected information. She held him steady while his breathing normalized. Then she gave him the signal. He followed. She had 3 operators now and 1 found position, the pressure vent she'd identified from the geological survey, 200 meters northeast of the primary extraction point. She needed to navigate to it in zero visibility with 3 operators in tow and Dugan somewhere behind her, and 1 remaining operator still unfound, and the combined team's oxygen clock running at a rate she didn't allow herself to calculate in specific numbers, because specific numbers in this situation were a form of distraction. She found the vent by thermal signature, a subtle temperature differential she felt through her gloved hands as she swept the ice ceiling, the specific warmth of geological upwelling that prevented the ice from sealing at this point. She located the opening. It was smaller than the survey had suggested, barely large enough for 1 person at a time, requiring an angled approach that would be disorienting for anyone who hadn't pre-oriented themselves to it. She sent the first operator up, then the second. She waited with the third, the one who'd been unconscious, whose oxygen she was still supplementing, and held the position until Dugan materialized out of the dark with the 4th operator in tow. She felt something release in her chest when she saw him. Not relief, she didn't allow relief until everyone was accounted for, but the specific recognition that the immediate math had just changed in her favor. She pointed Dugan and his operator toward the vent, sent the 3rd operator up behind them. She held position for 20 seconds, running a final sweep of the surrounding water by feel, confirming no presence she'd missed. Satisfied, she went up. She came through the vent last and found chaos managed. The 4 operators were on the ice surface. 2 were being treated by the emergency medical team that had reached the vent position. Harlan had moved them the moment Dugan radioed the location from underwater. The others were sitting up, breathing hard, alive. Dugan was on the surface already, talking to Harlan on the radio, giving positions and status in the clipped, efficient language of operational reporting. Laurel pulled off her mask and breathed the Alaskan air cold enough to hurt, clean enough to mean something. She looked at the 4 men she'd brought up. She looked at their faces. Young faces, most of them mid to late 20s. The faces of people who'd just spent time in a situation that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. One of them, the operator she'd stabilized, the one whose rebreather had faulted, looked at her. He was trying to figure out who she was, running the same confused calculation she'd watched run across Miles's face and Harlan's face and Dugan's face over the past 3 days. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was still rough from the oxygen fault. She looked at him. She was going to answer some version of the answer she'd been giving for 3 days when she heard boots on the ice behind her. She turned. Rear Admiral Everett Shaw was walking toward her across the frozen surface, in full uniform with 3 members of his staff behind him. He'd been at the extraction point. He'd been watching. She didn't know how long he'd been watching long enough. Apparently. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her for a moment. His face was unreadable in the way she'd always known it to be unreadable, the specific blankness of a man who had spent 40 years learning when to reveal what he knew. Then he looked at the operator who'd asked the question. "That," Shaw said, "is Commander Laurel Kane, decorated SEAL officer, former leader of Arctic Rescue Task Unit 6. He paused. "And as of this morning, the incoming commanding officer of this facility." The ice was very quiet. Shaw turned to the rest of the surface team, the operators, the medics, the communications personnel, Harlan's people who'd come to the vent position and were standing in a loose formation that hadn't been called to attention, but was close to it. "Attention on deck," Shaw said. The formation snapped too. Shaw let it hold for a moment. Then he looked at Harlan, who was standing at the edge of the formation with the expression of a man absorbing several things at once: the revelation of who Laurel actually was, the weight of what she'd just done under the ice, and something else that she could see working its way across his face like a tide coming in. "Commander Harlan," Shaw said, "she's been in your facility for 3 days. She identified equipment fraud that your logistics chief had been running for 14 months. She documented it, secured the evidence, facilitated a federal arrest, and just personally extracted 4 of your operators from a situation your corrupted equipment created." He paused. The pause had the particular quality of a man choosing his next words with complete deliberateness. "She also identified the root problem on her first morning in your briefing room," Shaw said, "where you called her sweetheart and told her to go organize forms." The formation was absolutely still. "She belongs here, Commander Harlan," Shaw said. "She was always going to belong here." Another pause. "She wrote half the doctrine your unit trains on." Harlan stood in the formation looking at Laurel with an expression she'd never seen from him before, something that had moved past the controlled professionalism of the past 24 hours and was now sitting in territory that didn't have a clean military name. Something like the look of a man standing in the wreckage of a map he'd been using wrong and trying to understand how he'd misread it for so long. He took 1 step forward. He came to attention in front of her. Not the casual attention of a formation. The real thing, the full formal posture of an officer addressing a superior. "Deliberate and complete, Commander Kane," he said. She looked at him. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not because of your rank. Because of what I did. Because I took a folder out of your hands and called you sweetheart in front of my unit and sent you to organize forms when you were trying to tell me something that mattered." His voice was steady. It cost him something to keep it that way, and he didn't try to hide that it cost him. "And because Miles Rowan tried to tell me something too, through proper channels, twice, and I built a command structure that let it disappear." He paused. "I'm sorry." The formation heard every word. Laurel looked at him for a moment. She thought about the briefing room. She thought about the folder hitting the table. She thought about the laughter. She thought about 2 men 7 years ago whose names she said to herself every February, and the specific drive that had brought her to this facility and this moment, not revenge. Nothing as simple as that, but the harder and more demanding thing, the need to make sure the failure that had cost her teammates never cost anyone else. "Apology accepted, Commander," she said. "Now let's get your people warm." She turned toward the medical team. Behind her she heard Shaw say quietly just to Harlan, "But the ice carried everything. She went back for you. You know that. She would have had everyone else out with time to spare." A pause. "I know," Harlan said. "Make sure you understand what that means," Shaw said. Laurel kept walking. She reached the first operator, the one who'd been unconscious, who still looked like someone processing more than his nervous system wanted to process at once, and crouched down beside him. "How are you breathing?" she said. "Better," he said. "Ma'am." "Commander." He stopped. He was working through something. She waited. "You shared your oxygen with me down there. You gave me your emergency supply. You needed it. He stopped again. I could have what, she said. He looked at her. He was 26, maybe 27. He had the eyes of someone who'd been in enough difficult situations to know what people do and don't do when a situation gets genuinely hard. You could have left me, he said. Made sure everyone else got out and come back for me. That's what the math said to do. Laurel looked at him. She thought about Harlan, trapped beneath collapsed ice, the man who'd taken the folder from her hands and called her sweetheart and laughed when his unit laughed. She thought about going back for him. She thought about the math that says leave the one to save the many, and the other math, the harder math, the one that isn't really math at all, that says you don't leave anyone. Nobody does the math like that down there, she said. You just go back. She stood up. The medical team was moving in. Shaw was issuing orders in the efficient shorthand of a flag officer who had been managing complex situations for 40 years. Dugan was on the radio, talking the remaining 8 operators through the primary extraction point now that the beacon corruption had been radioed to the team. Everybody was coming up. Laurel stood on the ice in the Alaskan cold, in a wetsuit, with the thermal weight of the operation still in her body, and the clarity that always came after the specific crystalline quality of a moment when the thing you went under the ice to do is done and everyone who went in is coming out. She looked at the horizon. The weather front was moving in from the northwest the way the forecast had said it would. The sky doing what Alaskan winter sky does when it has decided to make its point. She had 12 operators accounted for. She had a facility to run. And she had, for the first time in 7 years, the specific feeling of a weight that had been set down, not all of it. Never all of it, but enough to breathe on. Enough to build something on. Rear Admiral Shaw came to stand beside her. He looked at the horizon with her for a moment, the way old colleagues look at things together, not requiring conversation. Just sharing the view. You all right? He said. Yes, sir, that was close. It was the beacons, he said. We missed the beacons. I missed the beacons, she said. That's my accountability. Shaw was quiet for a moment. And you went back in anyway? Yes, sir, even for Harlan. Especially for Harlan, she said. If I'd left him, I'd have spent the rest of my career telling people that what matters is what's right, not who deserves it. She paused. I can't lead from that position if I don't mean it. Shaw looked at her sidelong. You know what your problem is, Kane? Several things. Sir, you actually believe it, he said. Everything you say you believe. You actually mean all of it. He shook his head slightly. Makes you very difficult to argue with, I know. Sir, makes you exactly what this facility needs. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The first of the remaining 8 operators came up through the primary extraction point 40 meters away, and then the second, and she watched them surface one by one into the cold Alaskan air alive, whole accounted for, and she felt the count complete in her chest the way a held breath finally releases. 12 in, 12 out, that was everything, that was the entire thing. The medical tent was warm in the specific way that emergency warmth is warm, not comfortable. Not reassuring but functional, the heat doing its job on bodies that had spent time in 37-degree water and needed to be brought back to something the human nervous system could work with. 12 operators, 12 sets of vitals being monitored by 2 Navy corpsmen who moved between them with the efficient calm of people trained to manage exactly this kind of aftermath. Laurel sat in the corner of the tent with a thermal blanket around her shoulders that she didn't remember accepting, watching the corpsmen work and running the inventory in her head the way she always ran it after an operation, not the equipment inventory, the human one. Who was where, who needed what, who was going to be all right, and who was going to need more time than they currently understood. The operator she'd stabilized underwater, she'd learned his name by now. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Gaines, 26 years old. 8 months past his SEAL qualification, was sitting 2 cots away with an oxygen mask over his face, and his eyes tracking everything in the tent with the specific hyper-alertness of someone whose nervous system had recently received information it was still processing. He looked at her every few minutes, not constantly, just checking, the way people check on something that matters. Dugan came in at 12:40 and sat down beside her without preamble, the way he'd been doing things without preamble since she'd met him. He was still in his wetsuit from the waist down, having shed the top half to let the corpsman check him over, and he had the look of a man who was physically tired in a way he'd long since made peace with. All 12 are stable, he said. I know. Shaw wants a full debrief at 1400. I know that too. Dugan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the row of operators, at Gaines with his oxygen mask, at the corpsman moving between cots. You went back for Harlan, he said. Yes, he was the last one out, yes. You had maybe 4 minutes on your emergency oxygen when you reached him. She didn't answer that. The math was what it was. She'd made the decision and the decision had worked out. And the part of her that was still running the alternate version, the version where 4 minutes wasn't enough, Where she'd cut it too close, where she'd traded herself for a man who'd spent 3 days dismissing her, was a part she was going to have to sit with later. In private, the way she sat with all the versions that didn't happen. He knows, Dugan said. He hasn't said anything to anyone. But he knows what you used to get to him. It doesn't matter. It matters to him. Dugan looked at her sidelong. It's going to matter to him for a long time. She shifted the thermal blanket on her shoulders. Senior Chief, you've been in this facility for how long? 2 years. Same as Harlan. In 2 years. How many times did you see someone try to report a safety issue and get shut down? Dugan was quiet. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know the answer. The quiet of someone deciding how honest to be with an answer they'd been living with for a while. 3 times that I know of, he said. Rowan twice. One other, a communications technician who flagged a beacon calibration problem 8 months ago. He paused. That one went to Vance directly. She was transferred to a different post 6 weeks later. Unsatisfactory performance evaluation. Laurel looked at him. Do you have her name? Petty Officer First Class Andrea Reyes. Currently assigned to Jaber. I want her file on my desk before the end of the week. Dugan nodded. He'd stopped being surprised by what she asked for. The culture didn't start with Vance, she said. It wasn't a question. No, Dugan said. Vance made it worse, made it dangerous. But the basic thing. The instinct to dismiss warnings from people who aren't senior enough to be worth listening to. He paused. That was here before Vance. It'll be here after him if nobody does anything about it. I'm going to do something about it. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you. The debrief at 1400 was held in the operations room with Shaw at the head of the table, Laurel to his right, Harlan across from her, and 6 members of Harlan's senior leadership filling the remaining seats. The rest of the facility operators, technicians, support staff would get the information through their chain of command afterward. But the people in this room were the ones who needed to hear it directly and completely, and without the management that information develops when it travels through a hierarchy. Shaw opened it. He was precise and unsparing in the way that the best flag officers are precise and unsparing, not theatrical, not looking for reaction, just moving through the facts in the order that told the story most clearly. The equipment fraud, Vance's falsification chain, the 19 inspections, the shell company, the beacons, the specific sequence by which 12 operators had entered the water with corrupted navigation equipment on top of the already compromised safety situation that had been building in this facility for 14 months. He named every failure. He named every person responsible for each failure. He did not soften anything. Then he said Commander Kane identified the rebreather issue in her first 14 hours on this facility. She identified the route problem in her first 30 minutes in this building. She documented the fraud, secured the evidence, and facilitated the federal arrest of Captain Vance before he could destroy the maintenance database. Shaw paused. This morning she went into the water and brought 4 of your operators back from a situation your corrupted equipment created. One of those operators was you, Commander Harlan. The room held that. The equipment failed because Vance falsified the certifications, Shaw continued. The fraud succeeded for 14 months because this facility did not have a functional channel for junior personnel to report safety concerns without that report being intercepted and suppressed by the officer it implicated. He looked around the table. Petty Officer Rowan reported this problem twice. Both reports disappeared. That is not Vance's failure alone. That is a leadership failure. He let that land. He was good at letting things land. Then he looked at Harlan. Commander Harlan has something to say. Harlan sat forward. He'd had 2 hours since the ice to compose himself, and he'd used those 2 hours in a way she could see. He looked like a man who'd had a genuine reckoning with himself and had come out the other side not undamaged but clear. Clearer than she'd seen him since she arrived. I owe this unit an apology, Harlan said. Not a statement. Not a qualified acknowledgement, an apology. He looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with each person in sequence. I built a command structure that allowed a senior officer to suppress safety reports, because I didn't build a redundant reporting channel that he couldn't control. I dismissed Commander Kane's operational assessment on her first morning here because of how she looked and what credentials she carried, not because I'd evaluated the substance of what she said. I created a culture in this unit where that kind of dismissal of someone who didn't look like what we expected expertise to look like was acceptable. Was entertainment. He stopped. The room was absolutely still. Miles Rowan tried to prevent what happened this morning, Harlan said. He did his job. Twice. I didn't build a system that let his job matter. Another pause. Commander Kane's rank is not what made my behavior wrong. She deserved to be heard when she walked into that briefing room. A genuinely inexperienced civilian employee deserved to be heard. Any person in any room who raises a safety concern deserves to be heard. That is the standard this unit failed, and it is the standard I failed. And I am sorry for it. Nobody moved. Laurel looked at him. She thought about the first morning, the folder, the laughter, the walk down the corridor away from men who had already decided what she was. She thought about sitting in the administrative records room that first afternoon, building the case alone because there was no version of her cover that allowed her to walk into Harlan's office and say what she'd actually found. She thought about Miles's face when she'd told him his reports mattered. She thought about whether an apology in a conference room was enough. It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. But it was real, and it was the beginning of something that could become enough if the work behind it was real too. She'd seen enough institutional change to know that the apology was never the change, it was just the moment the change became possible. "Thank you, Commander," she said. "Now let's talk about what comes next." What came next was harder than the apology. Shaw gave her the room after the formal debrief, literally gave it to her. Standing up and saying she has the floor, and sitting back in a way that made it clear the next hour belonged to Laurel, and whatever she decided to do with it. The senior leadership stayed. She'd asked them to stay. She needed them to hear this directly. "Vance is in federal custody," she said. "He will be prosecuted. That part of this is over." She looked around the table. What is not over is the question of what kind of facility this is going to be, not what it was before Vance, because before Vance it had problems that Vance made worse but didn't create. What it's going to be now. She paused. She wanted this to land before she continued. "I'm going to tell you something about how I work, so there's no ambiguity going forward. I don't run facility. I run people. The difference matters." She looked at the faces around her senior enlisted, junior officers, the specific mix of experience and rank and ego and genuine capability that made up any military unit. A facility is buildings and equipment and procedures. People are the thing that makes all of that mean something or not mean something. When the people are right, the facility runs itself. When they're not, no amount of procedure fixes it. One of the junior officers, a lieutenant named Park, who'd been in the operations room during the beacon failure, and had managed that situation with the composure of someone 10 years older than he was, said, "What does right look like, ma'am?" "Right looks like Petty Officer Rowan in the equipment storage room," she said. "Doing his job twice when it cost him something both times. Right looks like Senior Chief Dugan in the maintenance bay at midnight, securing evidence without knowing why, trusting that the reason was good enough." She paused. "Right looks like a 26-year-old operator underwater this morning, registering that something was wrong with his equipment and doing exactly what he was trained to do, stopping, conserving, waiting, even though waiting in 37-degree water under ice is one of the harder things a person can make themselves do." She let that sit. "Right does not look like a briefing room that laughs when someone raises a concern," she said. "Right does not look like a certification chain where one officer's signature is the only verification. Right does not look like a junior technician having to choose between his career and 12 people's lives." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Those are the things we are changing. Starting today." She outlined what she'd been building in her head since the ice-specific, concrete, non-negotiable changes to the facility's reporting structure, its equipment verification protocols, its exercise authorization chain, a redundant safety reporting channel that bypassed the direct command structure and went simultaneously to the facility commander and an external naval special warfare safety officer, an independent equipment verification requirement for any life support component, requiring sign-off from both the logistics officer and the senior equipment technician. Miles's position, newly formalized and newly protected. A mandatory review by the lowest-ranking person in the room at the conclusion of every mission briefing. That last one got a reaction. Not resistance, just the particular silence of people processing something that cuts against a long-standing institutional instinct. Every briefing, she said, before authorization is signed, the most junior person in the room gets asked what everyone else might have missed. Not as a formality, as a genuine question that the room is required to sit with. She looked at Park. "You want to know what right looks like? That's what it looks like. It looks like building a system that doesn't depend on heroism to function. Because heroism is not a protocol. You can't write it into a procedure. You get it when you get it, and you cannot count on getting it when you need it." She paused. "The system has to work without heroes. The heroes are the margin." Park nodded slowly. Around the table, she could see the things she was saying being absorbed, not universally, not completely, not without the friction of institutional habit, but genuinely, reaching people who were ready to be reached. Harlan said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. "Your cooperation and your honesty. In that order. You have both, I know," she said. "That's why I'm not removing you from this facility." The room reacted to that, a subtle collective shift. People who had been waiting for that decision and hadn't known it registering its resolution. Harlan himself went very still. which told her that he'd been waiting for it too and hadn't let himself expect a particular outcome. A formal leadership review will determine your ongoing role, she said. That review will include everything: the briefing room, the pool, the command structure that allowed Rowan's reports to disappear. It will be honest and it will be complete. She held his gaze. You have a career of genuine service. You are good at what you do. Those things are real and they matter. They are not, however, a balance sheet that offsets the culture you allowed to develop. Both things are true at the same time. She paused. The review will decide what your role here looks like. But I'm not removing you before that review is complete, because removing you today doesn't fix anything. It just transfers the problem to the next command. Harlan looked at her with an expression she didn't have a clean name for, something that lived in the territory between gratitude and the particular discomfort of being treated fairly by someone you'd wronged. Thank you, Commander. Don't thank me yet, she said. The review is going to be uncomfortable. I know. Good. Shaw found her afterward in the corridor outside the operations room, the same corridor where she'd walked past Harlan on her first night, where he'd told her to stay out of the maintenance bay, and she'd told him she already had what she needed. A corridor she'd spent 3 days moving through as someone she wasn't. That was well done, Shaw said. It's a start. The Rowan thing, Shaw said. Making his position official. Protected status, independent sign-off authority. That's going to push back from the logistics community. I know, you'll need documentation. Formal justification for the restructure. I have 62 hours of documentation, she said. I have 19 falsified inspection records. I have a federal fraud case and a 27-year-old technician who was threatened with career termination for doing his job correctly. She looked at Shaw. Let them push back. Shaw almost smiled. He had the face of a man for whom almost smiling was a significant expression. The Reyes transfer, he said. You know about that, Dugan told me. Petty Officer Andrea Reyes flagged a beacon calibration issue 8 months ago and got transferred with a negative evaluation. That evaluation is going to be hard to reverse. Vance wrote it. The chain of custody on the documentation. I'll build the case, she said. Whatever it takes. Shaw looked at her for a moment. You know, when I assigned you to this facility, I told you your mission was to identify the equipment fraud and determine whether the leadership could still be trusted. Yes, sir. I did not anticipate that you would personally extract 4 operators from under the ice in the process. The mission parameters evolved. They did. He paused. I also did not fully anticipate that you would come in here with the intent to rebuild the entire institutional culture of the facility from the inside. Was that outside my mandate? No, he said. It's well within your mandate as the incoming commanding officer. I just wanted to name it. Because what you're doing is harder than what I asked you to do. And because I think you know that. She looked at him. Sir, 2 of my men died 7 years ago because someone didn't listen to a warning from someone they'd decided didn't matter. I have thought about that every February since then. Every single one. She paused. I didn't come to Kodiak to arrest a corrupt officer. I came here to make sure that the thing that killed my teammates doesn't kill anyone else's. The fraud was part of it. The culture was always the main thing. Shaw was quiet for a moment. Morrow and Chen, he said, the names of her teammates. He said them carefully. The way you say names that belong to something that cost someone more than ordinary things cost. Yes, sir. You never stop. No, sir. He nodded once. The conversation had reached the place where more words would have been less than what had already been said, and Shaw understood that with the instinct of a man who'd been having difficult conversations for 40 years. I'll get you what you need for the Reyes case, he said, and for the restructure documentation. Thank you, sir. He walked back toward the operations room. She stood in the corridor alone for a moment, with the weight of the day settling onto her in layers. The water, the 4 operators, Harlan on the ice, his oxygen mask, Shaw's voice saying their names, and she let it settle without fighting it. You didn't fight the weight. You learned to carry it. Miles Rowan came to find her at 1600, in the administrative records room where this had all started, where she'd been at 5:30 that morning, running serials numbers and building a case that had since become something she hadn't entirely planned. He came in the same way he'd come in 2 days ago, carefully, with the posture of someone who was still recalibrating what it meant to be in a room where his concerns were taken seriously. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up. Petty Officer Rowan, she said. He paused. Commander. I'm not sure which one to use. Either works. He came in and stood in front of her desk. She'd moved to the facility commander's office. Or rather, Shaw had moved her there by the simple act of telling the administrative staff to prepare it, which had prompted a 40-minute reorganization of furniture and credentials that Laurel had observed with the detached bemusement of someone who had spent 3 days operating without any visible authority, was now being given a room that asserted it formally. I heard what you said in the debrief, Miles said. About the reporting structure. The new position, Technical Integrity Officer, she said. Formal designation. Independent sign-off authority on all life support equipment. Direct reporting line to me and to Naval Special Warfare Safety Command simultaneously. Protected from command interference by standing order, she paused. The job you've been doing for 6 weeks officially. With the protection you should have had from the beginning. Miles looked at her. He was doing the thing again, the processing calculation. The weight of something being offered against the instinct of someone who'd been told twice that what he did didn't matter. I threatened Vance's career, he said in my head. After he threatened mine, I thought about going over his head. Going to Harlan directly, blowing the whole thing open. Why didn't you? Because I was scared, he said simply. Because I looked at the rank differential, and the career implications, and the fact that I had no proof that anyone above Vance would respond differently than Vance did. And I was scared. He met her eyes. I'm telling you that because I think you should know. I wasn't brave, I was scared, and I held on to the scan because I couldn't make myself delete it. Not because I had a plan. Laurel looked at him. Miles, do you know what courage actually is? He waited. It's not the absence of fear, she said. It's the scan on your personal phone for 6 weeks when deleting it would have been easier. It's filing the second report after the first one cost you. It's being scared and holding on to the thing anyway because the alternative is 12 people under the ice. She paused. That is exactly what courage is. The clean version, the version where you're not scared and you do it anyway, that version barely exists. The real version is what you did. Miles absorbed that. She watched it land on him, not deflecting it, not qualifying it away, actually letting it mean what it meant. The Reyes transfer, he said. Andrea Reyes. I knew her. She flagged the beacon issue. I knew about it when it happened and I didn't do anything. I told myself it wasn't my system, not my inspection area. He stopped. It was an excuse. I was still scared from what Vance had already said to me. I know, Laurel said. I'm going to fix her record. Is there anything I can do to help? She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. Write down everything you remember about the beacon situation. What she told you. What happened after, anything. Your statement is going to be part of the case to reverse her evaluation. Miles nodded. He was already reaching for his notebook, the same instinct she'd noticed in him from the beginning, the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation was the thing that made truth durable. One more thing, she said. He looked up. The new briefing protocol. End of every mission briefing. I ask the most junior person in the room what everyone else might have missed. She paused. You're going to be in a lot of those briefings in your new role. I want you to understand that when I ask that question, when anyone asks that question, the answer matters. Not as a formality, not as a cultural gesture, it actually matters. I know, Miles said. I learned that the hard way, most of us do, she said. He left. She turned back to the desk, the commander's desk, her desk now, with its stacks of facility documentation, and its view of the corridor where she'd spent 3 days as someone else, and its implicit weight of everything the next months were going to require. Harlan came at 1800, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected the formal meetings, the leadership review process, the restructuring conversations, the accountability proceedings that were going to occupy the next several weeks. She hadn't expected him to come to her office at the end of the day. Alone, without a formal agenda, he knocked. She told him to come in. He stood in front of her desk the way Miles had stood, except differently, with the specific posture of a man who knows his standing in a room has fundamentally changed and is deciding in real time how to occupy the new position. I wanted to say something that I couldn't say in the debrief, he said. Sit down, Commander. He sat. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then at her. 7 years ago, your teammates. She waited. I've been doing the math, he said. You said February. 7 years. 2 operators lost. He paused. I was running a training detachment at Little Creek at the time. I remember hearing about it. I remember the official version was equipment failure in extreme conditions. Operator error contributing factor. Yes, she said. That was the official version. Was there a warning? She looked at him steadily. A technician flagged a component issue 48 hours before the mission. The report went to the logistics officer. The logistics office certified the equipment as mission ready. The room was very quiet. The route, Harlan said. The pressure ridge, this morning. The route you asked me to change. Same failure mode, she said. Different geography. Same assumption that the ice would hold because someone with rank said it would hold. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she recognized from the pool, not the controlled authority of the briefing room, not the professional steadiness of the midnight operations session, but something more exposed than either. The face of a man absorbing something that has just reorganized the meaning of everything that came before it. You came here for them, he said. I came here so it wouldn't happen to anyone else's team, she said. That's the same thing. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. When I took the folder from you, he said slowly. When I said, you had already lost people on a route exactly like the one I'd marked. You were standing in that briefing room having already paid the specific cost of what I was about to do. And you didn't know, she said. I didn't look, he said. That's not the same thing. She held his gaze, she said. It's not. He accepted that. She could see it land on him without defense. Without qualification, accepted directly. The way hard things need to be accepted to actually mean something. The review, he said. Whatever it determines, I want you to know that I'm not going to manage it. I'm not going to run the version of events that minimizes my exposure. I'm going to tell them what I did and what I didn't do and let the process work. I know, she said. How do you know? Because of how you apologized in the debrief, she said. A man who was going to manage the review doesn't apologize like that in front of his entire senior leadership. Harlan looked at her for a moment with an expression that had moved fully out of the territory of command dynamics and into something more simply human. For what it's worth, he said, I think what you're building here is the right thing. The reporting structure, the briefing protocol, Rowan's position, he paused. I think it's the thing this facility has needed for a long time. Longer than Vance, I know, she said. That's why it took someone coming in from outside to see it. He nodded. He stood to leave. At the door, he stopped, not the way he'd stopped conversations before, not to make a point or reclaim authority, but simply pausing with something still on him. Harlan, she said. He turned. You came back to the surface, she said. When I brought you up. You had about 30 seconds of oxygen left, and you were conscious enough to know that. The first thing you said, do you remember? He looked at her. I said, who else? Yes, I needed to know if everyone else was out. Yeah, she paused. That's the thing I'm building on. That instinct. Whatever else was wrong, whatever the culture allowed, whatever the command structure failed to catch, that instinct is real in you. I saw it this morning. She held his gaze. Don't waste it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked like a man who had been handed something he wasn't entirely sure how to carry yet, but who understood that carrying it was what came next. Yes, ma'am, he said. He left. The office was quiet. Outside, the Alaskan evening was coming down in the way it came down here, fast. Total, with the specific completeness of a darkness that had no ambiguity about it. Laurel sat at her desk and looked at the facility commander's nameplate that someone had placed at its edge, Commander Laurel Kane, the letters clean and permanent, and felt the full weight of what it represented. Not the rank, not the vindication, the responsibility. The 12 operators who'd come up through the ice. Miles's notebook, Dugan's steadiness, had said quietly on the surface. Jandra Reyes's record waiting to be fixed. The work was just beginning. She pulled the first file toward her and opened it. The first thing Laurel did on her first official morning as commanding officer of the Kodiak Naval Arctic Warfare Training Center was walk the maintenance bay alone at 0500. Before anyone else was in the building, not inspecting. Not auditing. Just walking, she moved through the space slowly, running her hands along the equipment racks the way she'd run her hands along the ice ceiling 2 days ago, reading it by touch, by the specific texture of a place that had been the center of everything. The rebreather rack was full again, all 12 units remounted with verified components, Miles's handwriting on every receiving log. The beacon storage was on the opposite wall, each unit tagged and numbered. The 4 corrupted units pulled and quarantined in a separate locked case, awaiting federal evidence processing. She stood in front of the rack for a long moment. 14 months. Vance had been running his fraud for 14 months in this room, in this space, with equipment that looked right and documented as right and was catastrophically wrong. 14 months of inspections that weren't inspections. Certifications that weren't certifications, a paper trail designed to look like safety and function as its opposite. She thought about all the exercises that had run in those 14 months. All the operators who'd gone in the water on Vance's certified equipment without knowing what they were breathing through. The ones who'd come up fine not because the equipment was safe, but because the failure conditions hadn't aligned yet. Because the temperature hadn't been cold enough, or the dive hadn't been deep enough, or the duration hadn't been long enough to push the counterfeit components past their actual tolerance. Luck. 14 months of luck dressed up as safety protocol. She was going to replace every piece of that with something that didn't depend on luck. She left the maintenance bay at 0530 and went to her office and started working. The Leadership Review Board convened on Monday morning, 6 days after the ice. Shaw had appointed the 3-member panel himself, a captain from Naval Special Warfare Command, a JAG officer with special operations experience, and a senior enlisted advisor who'd spent 30 years in SEAL teams and had the specific credibility that comes from having seen everything. They worked through the week with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood that the findings were going to matter beyond this facility, beyond this case, into the broader question of how naval special warfare handled command accountability. Laurel testified for 4 hours on Tuesday. She was precise and complete, and she did not soften anything, not the briefing room, not the pool, not the way Vance's fraud had operated inside a command culture that made it easier. She didn't perform outrage. She just told what happened, in the order it happened, with the documentation she'd built sitting in a stack on the table beside her. Harlan testified for 6 hours on Wednesday. She didn't sit in on his testimony. That wasn't her place, and she'd told him it wasn't going to be her place, that the review was going to work without her thumb on it in either direction. But she heard from the JAGI officer on Thursday morning that Harlan had done what he said he was going to do, told everything, qualified nothing, accepted the full accounting without managing it toward a favorable conclusion. The JAG officer said it with the particular tone of someone who'd expected something different and was recalibrating. He didn't try to protect himself, he said. I've been doing these reviews for 18 years. Officers at his level, they always try to protect themselves. He just told the truth, I know, Laurel said. You expected that, I hoped for it. There's a difference. The review board issued its findings on Friday afternoon. Harlan was formally censured for the briefing room conduct, the pool incident, and the command structure failures that had allowed Rowan's reports to be suppressed. He was removed from command of the detachment. He was not separated from service. He was assigned to the Kodiak facility as a senior instructor, pending a 12-month probationary review under Laurel's command. She'd recommended that outcome. The board had accepted it. She'd spent 2 days writing the recommendation, making the case not for leniency but for the specific proposition that removing Harlan from naval special warfare entirely wasted something real: his Arctic expertise, his operational history, the 20 years of genuine competence that existed alongside the failures, and that the better outcome was transforming what he was into something the facility could actually use. Shaw had called her after the findings were issued. You know, people are going to say you went easy on him, he said. People who say that are focused on punishment, she said. I'm focused on what the facility looks like in a year. A pause. And what does it look like? Better, she said. If he does the work, and if he doesn't, then I remove him, and nobody can say I didn't give him the opportunity to be something better. She paused. Sir, I didn't come here to end Bryce Harlan's career. I came here to build something that doesn't produce another Bryce Harlan. Shaw was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the right answer. I know, sir. Andrea Reyes arrived at Kodiak on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the ice, on a transport flight from Javier that landed in weather so bad the pilot had to make 2 approaches before getting down. She came off the aircraft in her cold weather gear, a duffel over one shoulder, and stood on the tarmac with the particular posture of someone who's been told to report to a new assignment without being told why, and has spent the transit time running worst-case scenarios. Laurel was waiting on the tarmac. That was deliberate, not sending someone to collect her, not meeting her in the office, but being physically present at the aircraft when she stepped off, so that the first thing Andrea Reyes saw at Kodiak was the commanding officer of the facility coming to meet her personally. Reyes saw her and came to attention immediately. Petty Officer First Class Reyes, reporting as ordered. Ma'am. At ease, Laurel said. Welcome to Kodiak. Reyes relaxed fractionally, the careful relaxation of someone who is still assessing the situation. She was 31, with the precise bearing of a communications specialist who'd spent 8 years being right about technical things in environments that sometimes didn't want to hear that she was right. The negative evaluation in her file had the specific fingerprints of Vance's methodology vague, difficult to contest, positioned as performance concerns rather than the retaliation it actually was. Your transfer here is a correction, not a reassignment, Laurel said. She kept her voice even. This needed to be clear before anything else. Your evaluation from your previous post is being formally reviewed and will be expunged from your permanent record once the JAGI process completes, which will be within 60 days. She paused. You flagged a beacon calibration problem 8 months ago. You were right. The failure mode you identified contributed to a navigation crisis in a live exercise 3 weeks ago. Your report was suppressed by an officer who is now in federal custody. Reyes looked at her. Something moved across her face, not the relief Laurel had expected, but something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and has developed a relationship with the weight of it and isn't sure what they are without it. I thought I'd made a mistake, Reyes said after the transfer. I went back through everything I'd reported, every calculation, every reading, and I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe Vance was right that my methodology was flawed. She stopped. 8 months of thinking maybe I was the problem. You weren't the problem, Laurel said. I know that now, do you? Laurel looked at her steadily. Because knowing it in your head and knowing it in the place where it actually lives, those are different things. And I need you to know it in the second place before you can do the job I'm bringing you here to do. Reyes looked at her. What job? Communications and Navigation Systems Integrity. Independent Verification Authority. You will report directly to me and to Naval Special Warfare Safety Command simultaneously, and no single officer in this facility has the authority to countermand your equipment flag without my explicit sign-off. Laurel paused. You are going to be the person in this facility who is impossible to silence. I'm building the position around that requirement. Reyes stood on the tarmac in the Alaskan cold and processed that. Laurel watched her do it, watched the recalibration happen. The adjustment from 8 months of institutional damage to the reality of what was being offered. Why me? Reyes said finally. There are more senior, because you were right when it cost you everything, Laurel said. That's the qualification. There isn't a more important one. The changes move through the facility the way real changes move, not smoothly. Not without friction, but with the particular momentum of things that have been made structurally necessary, rather than just culturally encouraged. The redundant reporting channel went live in the second week. The independent equipment verification protocol was mandatory by the third. The briefing procedure every session ending with the lowest-ranking person in the room being asked what everyone else might have missed started in Laurel's first week and ran without exception. That last one was the hardest and the most important. The first time it happened in a full detachment briefing, the junior person in the room was a 24-year-old operations support specialist named Torres, who'd been on base for 11 weeks and had never been asked to contribute to a mission briefing in any capacity beyond operating the display equipment. When Laurel asked what Torres might have noticed that the room had missed, there was a silence not hostile, just the specific silence of an institutional habit confronting its opposite. Torres said, very carefully, that the communication window for the exercise overlapped with a scheduled maintenance period on the satellite relay system, and that the backup frequency hadn't been tested in the current weather configuration. The room checked. Torres was right. The backup frequency had a calibration drift that would have made it unreliable in the projected conditions. They corrected it before the exercise went live. Afterward, Laurel found Torres in the corridor. Good catch, she said. Torres looked like someone who'd been waiting to find out if what they'd done was going to cost them something. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to actually. You were supposed to actually, Laurel said. That's the entire point of the question. She paused. Write it up. What you caught, how you caught it, what the correction was. I want it in the facility log. Yes, ma'am, and Torres next time. Don't wait to be asked. If you see something, the channel is open. Use it. Torres nodded. She could see them recalibrating the specific adjustment of someone learning that the rules they'd internalized about who gets to speak and when have been replaced by different rules, and that the new rules actually mean what they say. That was the work. Not the dramatic moments, not the ice and the federal arrest and Shaw's voice calling the formation to attention. The work was Torres in the corridor, learning that their observation mattered. It was Reyes running her first independent equipment verification and signing her name to a finding that would have gotten her transferred 8 months ago. It was Miles in a briefing room, asking a follow-up question about a component specification and having the room actually engage with his answers instead of waiting for him to finish so they could continue. The work was small and daily, and it was everything. 6 weeks after the ice, Vance's federal case produced its first significant development, a sealed indictment on charges of fraud against the United States government, falsification of military records, reckless endangerment, and acceptance of illegal payments. The indictment listed 43 specific counts. The prosecution's evidence included every document Laurel had compiled, Miles's original reports, the shell company records, and the testimony of Gerald Vance, who had cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced charging agreement that his brother's lawyers were already contesting. Laurel read the indictment in her office on a Wednesday afternoon and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Too much had been lost for satisfaction to be the right word, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that the accounting was happening, that the thing Vance had built over 14 months was being taken apart with the same systematic thoroughness with which she'd built the case against it. She set the document down and picked up the next file on her desk. There was always a next file. That was what command actually was, not the moments of authority or revelation, but the continuous daily weight of the next file, the next decision, the next person who came to her door with a problem that needed thinking about rather than just processing. She'd come to understand in the weeks since the ice that she'd been carrying a specific weight for 7 years, not just grief, not just guilt, but the particular burden of a failure that hadn't been hers to carry but that she'd carried anyway because someone had to and she was still there and her teammates weren't. Morrow and Chen, February. The route that had killed them because someone with rank had been certain the ice would hold. She'd set part of that weight down on the surface at Kodiak, when she'd watched the 12th operator come up through the extraction point alive. She hadn't gotten rid of it, she didn't think she ever would entirely, and she'd stopped wanting to, because the weight was also the thing that made her do the work the way she did the work. But she'd set down the part of it that had been about proof, about demonstrating that what had happened tomorrow and Chen didn't have to be the permanent cost of military culture. It didn't have to be, she'd shown that. Now she had to keep showing it. One file at a time, one briefing at a time, one Torres in the corridor at a time. The thing with Harlan happened 8 weeks in, on a Tuesday morning that was ordinary in every way until it wasn't. He'd been running the senior instructor role with the specific focused intensity of a man who understood that he was being watched, and had decided that being watched was appropriate, and that the best response to it was to be worth watching. He taught 3 courses: Arctic navigation, cold water emergency procedures, and leadership decision-making under extreme conditions, the last of which he'd proposed himself, and which Laurel had approved with the particular interest of someone who understood exactly why he'd proposed it. She was in the back of the leadership course on its 5th session. Observing, not evaluating, she'd been clear about that with him. Just present when the new female technician walked in. Her name was Petty Officer 2nd Class Kim, and she'd been at the facility for 3 weeks, assigned to the communications division under Reyes. She'd come to the briefing because her equipment was going to be used in the exercise being discussed, and she sat near the back with her notebook and her careful posture and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. Then she raised her hand. The room registered it, the slight pause in the collective attention, the micro-adjustment of a group recalibrating to an unexpected input. Kim was junior. Her voice, when she spoke, had the careful precision of someone who has thought through exactly what she's going to say before saying it, because she's learned that she won't always get a second chance. The navigation battery in the unit we're planning to use for the eastern checkpoint, she said. I ran a diagnostic on it yesterday as part of my standard equipment check. The charge retention curve looks off. It's within the acceptable range on the current reading, but the degradation rate over the past 72 hours is outside normal parameters for this battery type in these temperatures. The room absorbed this. A few of the operators exchanged glances, not dismissive. Just the reflex of people hearing a technical detail that sounds minor and trying to assess whether it is. One of the senior operators said it's within range. Right, the reading is within range? The current reading is, Kim said. The trend isn't. Another operator, we checked the current reading. That's the protocol. Laurel watched from the back of the room. She did not move, she did not speak, she watched Harlan. He'd been standing at the front of the room while this exchange happened, and he'd been still in a way that told her he was paying attention to more than the surface of it, to the shape of it. The familiar shape of a junior person raising a concern in a room that was about to decide how much the concern mattered. He raised one hand, the room went quiet. We don't laugh at warnings here, Harlan said. His voice was level, not defensive, not performing, just saying the thing that needed to be said in the room where it needed to be said. We listen before the ice teaches us the lesson. He looked at Kim. Pull the battery. Run a full diagnostic cycle. If the degradation trend holds, we replace it before the exercise. Yes, sir. And Petty Officer Kim, write it up what you found. What the trend showed, what correction was made. I wanted in the facility log the same words Laurel had said to Torres 6 weeks ago. She noticed. She didn't think Harlan knew she'd said them, she hadn't told him. But he'd arrived at the same words through his own working through of what this facility was supposed to be. And that arrival mattered more than if she'd handed him a script. The battery was examined. The degradation trend held a manufacturing defect in the thermal management layer that would have caused complete power failure in sustained sub-zero conditions. An entire team's emergency beacon system failed at the worst possible moment. Laurel learned about it from Miles, who heard it from Reyes, who got it from Kim's written report. She read the report in her office and sat with it for a moment. Then she went to find Harlan. She found him in the equipment storage room. He gravitated there when he was thinking. She'd noticed the same way Miles ran inventory and Dugan cleaned equipment. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. He looked back. You heard, he said. Kim's report. She caught it because she was looking, he said. Because she knew looking was the job and that what she found would be taken seriously. He paused. 3 months ago, in this facility, she would have run that diagnostic and looked at the within-range reading, and convinced herself the trend probably didn't mean anything, because the alternative raising it cost more than she could afford. Yes, Laurel said. That's what we changed, he said. That's the actual thing. She looked at him. He was right, and he knew he was right. And what she could see in him was the specific quality of someone who had done genuine work on themselves in the space between who they were and who the situation required them to be, not perfectly, not without the residue of old habits, but honestly, consistently, every day, in the small choices that nobody notices and that add up to character over time. How's the course going, she said. Leadership decision-making. He considered it. Hard to teach, easy to demonstrate, he paused. I've been using the briefing room as a case study. What happened when you walked in, what I did, what the cost of it was. His jaw tightened slightly. The operators hate it. Makes them uncomfortable. Good, she said. Yeah, he said. I figured you'd say that, she almost smiled. Keep using it, I will. He looked at her steadily. Commander, I want to ask you something. Go ahead. Morrow and Chen, he said the names carefully, the way Shaw had said them. The technician who flagged the component issue before that mission. Do you know what happened to them? She looked at him. She knew exactly what had happened to that technician. She'd tracked it down 3 years after the mission, when she'd had the clearance and the position to access the records. The technician, a 25-year-old equipment specialist named Torres, no relation to the operations support specialist at Kodiak, had been given an unsatisfactory performance evaluation by the logistics officer who'd overridden his report. He'd been transferred. He'd separated from the Navy 18 months later. She'd found him working at a marine supply company in San Diego. She'd never contacted him. She hadn't known what to say that wouldn't reopen something he might have finally put down. She told Harlan all of this. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. We should find him, he said. She looked at him. He deserves to know he was right, Harlan said. He deserves to know that what he flagged was real, and that someone listened and that it mattered. He paused. Even if it's 12 years late. Laurel stood in the equipment storage room and felt something shift in her chest, not a large thing, but a real one. The specific movement of a weight she hadn't known she was still carrying. She'd been so focused on building the system, on the structural changes, the reporting channels, the verification protocols, the culture work. She'd been thinking forward toward Torres and Kim and everyone who would come after, and she hadn't been thinking backward. Hadn't thought about the other Torres, the one who'd been right 12 years ago and had never been told. Yes, she said. We should. Harlan, I'll help find him. If you want. I want, she said. The morning she'd been thinking about since before she arrived at Kodiak came on a Saturday in late April, 4 months after the ice. She'd planned it deliberately, a full team exercise. All 12 operators from the Thursday exercise plus 8 newly assigned personnel, running a cold water infiltration route that she'd designed herself. The route was longer than any in the current training library, harder than anything the facility had run in 3 years, demanding in ways that tested not just physical capability, but the specific kind of judgment that develops when people trust each other enough to be honest about their limits. The debrief ran 2 hours. It was the debrief she'd ever sat in, not because everything had gone perfectly, but because when things went wrong, people said so immediately and accurately, and the room worked the problem together without anyone managing their exposure. Miles identified a scrubber issue at minute 40 and had it corrected by minute 43. Reyes flagged a beacon drift in real time and the navigation team adjusted without breaking stride. Kim, running communications from the command center for the first time in a primary role, caught a weather pattern shift that the exercise planners had missed and communicated it to the team in the water with the calm precision of someone who knew her voice mattered and used it accordingly. Afterward, when the debrief was done and the team was dispersing, Laurel walked out onto the frozen coastline. She didn't go alone. She hadn't planned to go with anyone, but Dugan fell into beside her without being asked, which was how Dugan had operated since the first night in the maintenance bay, and she found she didn't want to tell him to go back. They walked without talking for a few minutes. The coastline was white and flat, and the morning light was doing what Alaskan April light does when it's finally returning, not warm yet, not fully but present in a way that felt like a promise. Good exercise, Dugan said. Yes. Kim had a good morning. She did. Rowan's been teaching her the equipment verification protocol. After hours. Laurel looked at him sidelong. I know, I've been watching. Of course you have. He was quiet for a moment. Reyes told me she slept through the night for the first time in 8 months last week. She said it was the first time since the transfer she didn't lie awake running through whether she'd made a mistake. Laurel felt that land. She let it. It's not going to be fast, she said. The institutional damage. What Vance did to her, what the transfer did, it's going to take longer to heal than it took to cause, I know, Dugan said. But it's healing, that's the thing. They walked a little further. The ice underfoot was solid, she'd checked it, out of habit. out of the specific habit of someone who had learned that checking was the job, and that the job didn't stop because the exercise was over. Morrow and Chen, she said, not to Dugan specifically. Just out loud. Yeah, he said. I'm going to find their families, she said. I've been thinking about it since Harlan mentioned the other Toras. The families never got the full accounting. The official version was equipment failure, operator error contributing. They never knew that someone had flagged the problem and been ignored. She paused. They deserve to know their people did everything right. Yes, Dugan said. They do. It won't fix anything, no, but it'll be true. And true matters. She stopped walking. She looked at the coastline, the ice, and the water beyond it, and the particular quality of this place that had been her assignment and had become something else. Something she hadn't fully anticipated when Shaw had given her the mandate. She'd come here to fix a facility. She was leaving, not leaving. She'd be here for years, but leaving the version of herself that had arrived something different. Not easier, just clearer. The way things get clear when you've done the work that needed doing and can see the shape of it now that it's done. Behind her, she heard boots on the ice. She turned. Harlan was walking toward them from the main building. And behind him, in a loose group that was almost but not quite a formation, were the 12 operators from the exercise, still in their cold weather gear, moving in the particular way of people who have just done something hard together and are still in the residue of it. Harlan stopped a few feet away. He looked at her. The team wanted to walk the shoreline, he said. I told them you were out here. She looked at the 12 of them, Gaines in the middle of the group, the one she'd stabilized underwater, the one who'd asked she was and been told by an admiral while standing on the ice. He caught her eye and held it for a moment with the steady gaze of someone who understood exactly what he owed and had decided to honor it by becoming someone worth owing it to. She turned back to the water. Then let's walk, she said. She didn't move to the front of the group. She moved to the middle of it, not ahead of them to display her authority, not behind them to observe from a distance, but beside them, in the space between, where leadership actually lived when it was working the way it was supposed to work. They walked the frozen shoreline together in the early morning light. 12 operators and a senior chief and a commanding officer who had arrived at this facility 72 hours before any of them knew who she was, and who had spent 4 months since then building something that would outlast all of them. Harlan fell into step on her left. Dugan was on her right. The ice held under all of them, solid and real and checked. When the story of this facility was told in the years that followed in after-action reviews, in naval special warfare leadership courses, in the quiet conversations that happen between operators who've been through something that changed how they understand the work, it would always come back to the same moment. Not the ice, not the arrest, not Shaw's voice calling the formation to attention. It would come back to a woman walking beside her team on a frozen shoreline at sunrise, having already done the hardest thing, not the rescue, not the investigation, not the confrontation with 14 months of institutional failure, but the daily, demanding, unglamorous work of replacing a culture of silence with one where truth moved freely and warnings were heard before the ice made them permanent. Commander Laurel Kane had not come to Kodiak to prove she belonged. She had come to make sure that the next person who walked into a briefing room with something true to say would never have to prove it either. That was the mission. It was accomplished. It would need to be accomplished again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that, because that was the nature of culture work, that it was never finished, only continued, and she was exactly the person to continue it. The ice held. The team walked. The light was coming up over the water. That was enough. That was everything.